Good morning and welcome to everyone.
Hi.
It's not on.
Tá certo. Só puxar para frente.
Good morning and welcome to everybody to our workshop for the Insured project. Shaping cooperation for a world in transition, the global south and global governance transformation. My great honor to open our proceedings today with our first panel on global governance transformation. I have with me here on the panel Hilke Dijkstra from Maastricht University, Steven Blokman from the Center for European Policy Studies, Du Xingxuan from UIDE in Beijing, and Monica Hertz, from some of you from EDI here might know. She's from EDI and PUC here, and myself. So I guess without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers, and then everyone will have 15 minutes. They'll get a little bit more because they'll talk about the project. We'll just go in the order in the program here. So Hilke Dijkstra is the project coordinator of Insured. He's also a full professor of international security and cooperation at Maastricht University. He's interested in how increasing geopolitics and the deteriorating relations between states affect prospects for international cooperation. Hilke has also been the principal investigator of an ERC project on international relations and work package leader in 2 other Horizon projects. At Maastricht University, he serves as the director of the research program on politics and culture in Europe. He's a member of the Standing Committee on European Integration of the Dutch Advisory Council on International Affairs. Steven Blokman here far left. He is a senior research fellow and previously research director at the Center for European Policy Studies. He's also a senior fellow at ICDS, visiting professor at the College of Europe and editor-in-chief of the European Foreign Affairs Review. He's a frequent commentator on EU affairs at major media outlets and regularly briefs senior policy practitioners from the EU, its member states, and G20 country governments. He was a member of a Track 1.5 process between the EU and Russia and several Track 2 processes. He's the author of 2 books and has edited 20 volumes, including the EU's role in global governance of OUP in 2030. Du Xingxuan is Dean, Professor, and WTO Chairholder at the China Institute for WTO Studies of the University of International Business and Economics located in Beijing, China. He obtained his PhD in international trade from this university in 2004. He's previously been a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University, the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, the WTO Secretariat, the German Institute of International Security Affairs, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey as well. His research and teaching focuses on Chinese trade policy, WTO, US trade policy, and US-China trade relations. No lack of work for you. He is a member of Friends of Multilateralism Group, Asia WTO Research Network, Trade and Investment Research Network, and General Secretary of NICIS. He authored China's position, role, and strategy in the WTO, the 40 years of China's reform and opening up and China's integration into the world trade system, and has published a number of papers and chapters in books. He has been granted a number of research projects by the China Social Science Foundation, the Ministries of Commerce, Education, Finance, and others. He's also been frequently interviewed by CCTV, Phoenix TV, Bloomberg, Reuters, Xinhua, and other major media on hot issues about China's trade and economic situation and China's international economic relations. Monica Hertz holds a PhD in international relations from LSE. She is currently a full professor at the Institute of International Relations at PUC-Rio, where she coordinates the Digital Humanities Laboratory. Her expertise lies in international relations with an emphasis on international security, focusing primarily on the following areas: international politics, international organizations, international security, Latin American international relations, and Brazilian foreign policy. She has been a cientista do nosso estado, distinguished researcher at FAPERJ since 2012, and holds a productivity scholarship from St. Piquet. She is the author of International Organizations, History and Practices with Andrea Ribeiro Hoffman and Jonathan Baki, Ecuador versus Peru, Peacemaking amid Rivalry with Juan Pontes Nogueira, and the Organization of American States, Global Governance Away from the Media. He has also published numerous book chapters with international publishers and articles in academic journals in Brazil and abroad. Her current research focuses on arms flows in Latin America, regional governance, and Brazil's international security policy. She maintains an extensive international cooperation network for research in the field of international relations. And I'm not going to read my own short bio. Too weird?
You want me to?
No. So without further ado, please, Hilke.
This one.
This seems to work, right? Yes. Could I please
Yes.
get the slides? Maybe you're ready to start off. It's such a great pleasure to be here in Rio. I think when we started to think about this project, and that was in summer 2021, so 1 and 4 years ago, we started thinking about, when talking about global governance, it's so important to consider that perspectives from around the world. So really, the first priority for us was to think about, which are the type of academic partners in important countries around the world that we can work with. So we came up obviously with PUC-Rio, the college from Beijing, and a few others. And then I think the second thought that came to our mind was, well, we should not just involve all these partners, we should also travel to those locations, have them come to Europe to really build a type of epistemic community around global governance. Now, these were thoughts, 4.5 years ago, but now we're here in Rio, in the first event that this project is organizing around the world. So I think that's really for me, and I'm also sure for my dear colleague, Clara Reinhardt, really an important milestone for our project, an emotional one at that. I can also just have to say, what a wonderful host you have already been. You've put a considerable amount of effort in organizing this workshop. A fantastic program lined up for us, even close to the mic. Fantastic program lined up for us over the next 2 days. And so I think it's going to be incredibly insightful. What I am going to be doing in these 15 minutes is give a short recap of the project we've been doing. I will be presenting some of our first comparative project level findings. So that's going to be first for me as well. And again, I'm particularly looking forward to what the other colleagues of the panel have to say, but also the other panels today and tomorrow that will zoom in on a whole range of policy areas of concern to global governance. So maybe if I could go to the first slide. So that's the starting point of our project. Really is that the world is in transition, things are moving, and I think it's for all there to see. The BRICS have obviously been an important new international institution, a new platform for cooperation, going back these 15 years. But with the Durban Declaration in 2013 being an important statement of, hey, here are a number of important emerging countries that have also a view on how to organize global governance. That view differed from the type of traditional view that the Americans and Europeans have set up. The BRICS has obviously enlarged for the first time last year and now covers a whole range of countries. So global governance in that sense becomes wider. And that is interesting development, but I think also a policy challenge for the existing institutions on how to engage with that. Donald Trump, perhaps even more prominently, visibly in the media, his second term, 14 days into his term, he signed an executive order where he essentially ordered a review of all international treaties, organizations, regimes, with a view on seeing whether the US can withdraw from them, which is quite a development 80 years after San Francisco, 80 years after essentially the Americans setting up the post-war system. If you look more detailed at the number of institutions, you see also all sorts of challenges there. I've heard a number of vetoes in the UN Security Council, which is up again after relatively few vetoes in the 1990s. So I think that's an indicator of type of gridlock they have in New York. And obviously vetoes are only at the end of the line when it comes to negotiating resolutions. So I think it's an indicator of something something else. We see the United States again withdrawing from UNESCO. There are sanctions now in the International Criminal Court for a whole range of persons there. They have trouble in opening their Microsoft Office packages. It really goes in that type of people paying salaries, and because bank accounts get frozen. World Trade Organization will obviously hear a lot more from also in the next panel. But clearly, you know, world trade is being challenged at this moment, and the same for the World Health Organization. So I think a number of challenges and even problems on our agenda, and I think this is really the type of starting point for the project. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I've tried to put on one slide, you know, what the project is about, and I think the research question here we're trying to answer is, in light of this type of contested world in transition, how can global governance still be transformed, defended in a number of instances, with a view to make it more robust and effective and democratic. And so this is the type of research question we set ourselves, and we've been working on this for the last 2 years. With our project that includes 14 partners and 45 researchers. Now, over the last 2 years, we've done extensive empirical analysis. So colleagues, including the colleagues here on the panel and in the room, have worked on 15 case studies of all sorts of international institutions, and we're going to hear a lot about them in the next 2 days. We've also, and I think we're going to be publishing quite soon on that, we've been updating some of the important data sets in a few international organizations. A lot of the data sets, they run until 2010, perhaps 2015, so they really don't capture the type of last years, including, say, the first term of Donald Trump, but also essentially the push of the BRICS countries after Dublin 2013, that is all not covered in the existing data sets. And so I think a lot of the colleagues in the University of Potsdam in Germany have been working hard on bringing those data sets up to date. And you know, we can start to see different trends developing since 2010, 2015. And finally, we've had an expert survey in August, September. Yeah, we concluded in September. Essentially, everybody who knows something about international organizations around the world in academic positions has received an invitation from us. And more than 700 experts have filled out the surveys. So it's a fairly high response rate for this type of work. And we're now in the process of analyzing that as well. The expert survey included also questions on where do you see global governance going, you know, what type of institutional design of international institutions would be favored in case of certain challenges. So I think there's also rich material there about which we are going to be publishing soon. And now we're entering the last year of the project, last 12 months. We're running until October 2026. So last year of the project, and that's dedicated to academic publishing, but also a whole range of workshops and seminars. We do quite a few in Europe, in Brussels, but also European capitals, but indeed also in Geneva and New York at the UN. And we're now very happy to kick off these seminars here in Brazil, but we also go in January to Beijing. We are going to be visiting the United States as well. So it's important that we have that global discussion on global governance. Not unfortunately, the project has received generous funding by the European Union's research.
Are you showing the same?
Yeah. So if I can go now next to the next slide. So that was essentially the project in a nutshell. What I would want to zoom in a little bit now is the 15 case studies, because that will also be the topic, I think, the next 2 days. And we have done 15 case studies across 5 policy areas: trade, inequality, climate and biodiversity, global health, migration, human rights, and digitalization. And our colleagues have done by now a total of 187 interviews in those institutions with diplomats, from around the world. So, it's a very sizable body. Still some interviews are being done, so we might get to the 200. Colleagues have attended climate meetings, so participant observation, have organized stakeholder meetings with important experts and diplomats, document analysis. So really have a thorough analysis of 15 institutions across a whole range of policy domains. And what I want to now try to do is summarize some of the overall findings when reading through these 15 reports. So 10 of those reports are already on our website, and the last 5 will be on our website in the next four weeks. So it's all available. If I can have the next slide, please. Maybe 3 things to run through when considering these 15 policy, these 15 reports, these 15 case study reports, is one, what are the type of challenges on the agenda at these 15 institutions? What are the agendas and the impetus for reform? And second point is, what do major actors around the world want in terms of these 15 case studies? And finally, what type of reforms have we seen over the last 5-6 years, essentially since 2020? So maybe to start with the challenges and impetus for reform. Now we are talking obviously a lot about power transitions in international relations. We talk about popular backlash. That goes back to my first slide with Donald Trump featuring quite prominently. But when reading through these 15 case studies, that does seem to be somewhat simplistic. It's not necessarily only about that. Obviously, power transitions filter through the positions that major actors take. But if you really look at the reform agendas in many of these institutions, which was quite striking, is the changing problem structure, the changing problems in international relations provide a lot of input. And I think digitalization is a key driver here. And that's not just narrowly defined. There's a need for regulation on artificial intelligence, cryptocurrencies, and Matteo is sitting there, he's going to be talking about that. And these are also sort of new type of problems that come on the agenda needs regulation. I think that's pretty obvious. But digitalization is, for instance, also heavily running through the global trade agenda when thinking of e-commerce, digital services, but also thinking about type of digital taxation. So I think across the case studies, we simply see that there are new problems coming up that are difficult for a number of international institutions to address, that creates pressures for reform. There's a degree of complexity here as well. I think climate change is a very good example. It's difficult to address climate change. Public health is another example. So the complexity of problems also goes up, as well as the scope and numbers. The number of refugees, if you go to the website of UNHCR, is really frightening. It's an exponential graph, essentially, where the number of refugees registered with UNHCR is now about 3 times higher as 10 years ago. So, these are the type of problems that are driving reform agendas, as much as more type of dominant narratives like power transitions, popular backlash, and so forth. And the problems are changing and they're becoming more difficult. And so I think that's one of the first conclusions of these 15 case studies. If I can go to the next slide, please. Then the question for us is, what do major international actors want? Well, I think perhaps first point here, and I'm moving immediately into some of the final bullet points, is we see a lot of international institutions increasingly through a rivalry between the United States and China. But when looking at 15 case studies, a single case study, can we bring the case study back to the US-China rivalry? And it's much more complicated across the board. Indeed, if I added up all the actors that have been identified in the 15 case studies, we come to 21 important actors over 15 case studies. And it ranges, for instance, from Colombia being key actor on global health, to Indonesia being involved in digitalization on cyber. So it's really not just US, China, and somewhere Europe in the middle. It's a much wider spectrum of actors. Now running them through a number of the key actors, And what is also striking and really in your face when you think about it is that in 14 out of 15 case studies, we see strong US disengagement under Trump. Now, we obviously all knew this, right? That the US under Trump is not very favorable to the existing type of international institutions. But there's also some argument in the academic literature that, ultimately Trump is a strategist and he invests in the ones that he thinks work and he divests from the ones that thinks don't work. That's not what our case study evidence shows. He divests the US essentially from all of them. Not necessarily withdrawal, but also, for instance, just moving unilaterally on taxation while the UN currently is negotiating a tax treaty, right? So I think there's that real disengagement across the board. With regard to the EU, we see that the EU is the most comprehensive actor of all of them. The EU has a position on absolutely everything, but the EU has very difficulty prioritizing. So Europe wants global governance to be effective, robust, and democratic at the same time, essentially in most areas. And that's a problem, because I think that does not necessarily work. The other thing is what we've noticed is over the last 8 months is that Europe is not in a position to step into the type of gap left by the United States. And in terms of that political leadership, not everybody is looking at Europe as the logical leader, but also in financial sphere. So one of the troubles with the Trump administration is they are not paying any more the funding into the UN system. So the humanitarian sector is currently under tremendous amount of pressure where budgets need to be cut by 30-40%. And Europe is not stepping that money. Europe is not paying a penny extra. It's also not withdrawing the money, but it's not paying extra. So I think there is that type of vacuum there, and we don't see any evidence that Europe is stepping. China has obviously a very strong position on a number of points, including trade. We're going to hear more about it, but also climate, where China is an obvious leader, as we'll see next week here in Berlin. Perhaps a bit less involved on other issues. Global health, what I learned from Mirko and Oscar, is that China prefers a lot of bilateral relationships when it comes to health rather than necessarily the global system. So perhaps less pronounced on some points. India and also African group in different formations put strong emphasis on state representation, state participation, pushing the type of democracy card. And I think there is a bit of a disconnect there in the conversation between, say, Europe and India, to put it simply, where Europe, might want the system to run better, whereas India says, well, but first we need to have a few extra seats around the table, right? And this conversation is not really necessarily going very well. Brazil, particularly now under current administration, we see key positioning, obviously, with the climate summit in health, and also perhaps with other countries like South Africa, continuing to push for the type of human rights agenda internationally. But overall, key conclusion is, there are lots of actors. We cannot bring this easily back to US versus China. We need to consider this type of partnership relationships. Moving on to the third point, if I can have the next slide, please. Yeah, good. I'm getting to a conclusion here. Potential for transformation. So we've seen in the 15 case studies some limited type of formal treaty reform. The pandemic treaty being an important one, OECD taxation, and there are a few more cases, Council of Europe, AI Convention. So treaties are still being negotiated, but most of the focus is on incremental reforms, type of keeping deliberations going while gridlock is ongoing. Establishment of funds is an interesting thing. So in many of the case studies, new funds are being negotiated to do certain things. And there's also a bit of norm setting by international secretariats that continues, where secretariat officials publish reports on issues. And what I found particularly striking is that across the case studies, there are a wild number of great ideas on how to make global governance better. So within the expert communities around international institutions, there are all sorts of ideas, and they sometimes just need a little bit of leadership. and a little bit of inclusion, a little bit of imagination to make that happen. It's quite quickly and quite easy to say, well, yeah, there's no political will, but some of these things are quite, on a technical level, where just a bit of a push needs to work. And that brings me to my conclusion. If I can get the final slide, please. So, without a doubt, these are very difficult times for global governance. And our project has been trying to delve very deep into international institutions that go beyond the kind of headlines of geopolitics. And I do want to offer 3 reasons here still for some optimism. First of all, the challenge is often in the problem structure, and the problem not necessarily in the bigger power relationships. We see many different actor constellations, which also creates opportunities for partnering with actors around the world. And there are a good number of reforms ideas available that can be pursued. So our emphasis now for the next 2 days is to zoom in on a number of these institutions. And I cannot conclude but thanking Kai very much for organizing all of this. I'm very much looking forward to the panels we're going to have today. So thank you very much for hosting us and these.
Thanks. I need to say I was very remiss in not thanking immediately from the beginning Claudia and Isabelle for all the hard work that they put into organizing well, and help from Victoria and Milena as well. So thank you very much. And our next speaker is Steven Lokmans.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, for hosting this. Thank you, Claudia, for arranging everything so quickly. And thanks to Hilke and the entire team at Masik also for bringing us all together. This panel will not delve into the specific policy areas just yet. We're here presentations. So I'll pick up from where Hilke left and maybe discuss a few strategic choices that not just the EU, but the key actors that you mentioned, the 21 across 15 case study areas that ensured the study, will have to make in order to make a reality of this transformation towards a better global governance system. I don't want to mention good governance and global governance term which the EU uses in its own treaty. Because it's very hard to discern. Hilke already mentioned that we essentially, in kind of words perhaps, I'll put it a bit starker, we're seeing the unraveling of the multilateral system as the Western powers in particular, but also with China and with USSR at the time set it up after the Second World War, not just in institutional terms, but also in terms of treaties, international law conventions, etc. And no small state or indeed middle power can insulate themselves from this. Hilke has mentioned some of the reasons that lie behind, of course, growing geopolitical rivalry, as was mentioned. Before that, perhaps more starkly, pre-COVID, the uneven distribution of globalization's benefits and the rise of popular dissent, populism that eroded public and political support for more cooperative international frameworks. The COVID pandemic, of course, accelerated this move quite a bit, with total rupture in certain cases of, the global just-in-time supply lines, and fast forwarded in many cases a unilateral turn in geoeconomics. Most visibly, of course, over access to vaccines, and then more prominently later on, critical raw materials. And then the disengagement under Trump too, by the United States in so many areas already mentioned. Together, present a quite simple diagnosis, which is nevertheless horrific in a way for those small states and middle powers that seek shelter from international systems where the big powers are bound by the rules, or at least would try and keep those up as well. You've mentioned some of the symptoms already. I won't repeat them as far as the emerging powers are concerned, the BRICS with their divergent views from, the established or so-called West, cross-insured and different study areas, weak membership criteria, weak monitoring of supervisory and enforcement mechanisms across various institutional arrangements have, of course, led to softening of this fabric, the duplication of new institutions and mandates, of course, make coordination across those multilateral networks also more difficult. Lack of predictable funding was mentioned. And if you take a step back, perhaps, and look at all these case studies that the project so far has developed, it comes to my mind at least clear that there are few likely scenarios which flow from here. This is not, pure sang forecasting, methodologically grounded, but trends seem quite obvious. Discarding, a total reboot as a scenario of the multilateral system, but also discarding the total collapse of the system. I think there are three pathways which could converge at several times that can be distinguished. One would be an increased informalism in multilateralism, where core universal institutions persist, but increasingly rely on flexible governance mechanisms, on non-binding norms, coalitions of the willing, and that you see happening in various areas. A bit in the WTO, in the UN, FCCC as well. The second scenario would be what I would depict as more fragmentation and at the same time layering of the multilateral system, where you have overlapping regional, plurilateral type of governance arrangements that seem to proliferate, and the old universal systems, consensus-based, the United Nations, the WTO, forming less effectively. And the third pathway is, I think, we're partially also witnessing in certain areas, certain selective renewal, where there's targeted institutional reform where possible, stronger financing, clear compliance tools, improved representation in a way, to revive specific regimes. At least there is a desire among key actors, to go in that direction. There's perhaps precious little level of evidence of that just yet. There is some, and we'll hear more about it, but all of this falls short of system-wide restoration. And so if this is where it's all going, some of these pathways, as I mentioned, they could cross and overlap at certain points in time, then it becomes quite clear that for these 21 actors, and certainly for small states, for regional blocs like the European Union, they cannot hope to maintain the global governance system that is indeed simultaneously robust, effective, and democratic. They will have to make compromises. Their influence is basically blunted by the fact that they don't have the military might that allows the great powers to just do as they please, and as they have always done in a way. But also small and middle powers, small states and middle powers are more dependent on informal and soft law instruments, to get the buy-in of those great powers. But of course that reduces effectiveness and risks slower implementation. Financing shortfalls I've already mentioned. So they'll have to make choices. And then the question is, which choices should they make strategically? Knowing that there might be various pathways of transformation of the global governance system. So what type of multilateral arrangements are worth saving, worth fighting for? Which one should they favor, prioritize in that respect? Should it be regional? Should it be global? Should it be open? Should it be closed? Ad hoc at certain moments. Which of the properties also of global governance ought to be should they best focus on? And I'm sure we'll hear plenty of empirical evidence and that would suggest one or the other way. And are there any policy areas that should be prioritized, frankly? And in some cases, I think it becomes quite evident that there is no choice to be made. That there are, the urgencies that Hilke already talked about of a global nature. Some old ones, pandemics, are likely to come back. Climate change is on track. And the new ones, digitalization, as you mentioned, AI, crypto, e-services. All of this basically now means, I hope, Belen will be more positive than in this outcome than predict, but leads to delayed and weak responses to urgencies. So those commitments cannot be made at the moment. And without that reform, there are real risks. So if you think about those strategic choices, then in a more systemic way, then perhaps I would distinguish the methods that could be used, the instruments, and then the finance. I think coherence matters as well, specifically for regional blocks like the European Union, or indeed for like-minded groupings. But I'd like to focus on the first three ones. About the methods, there is an increased pressure on transactionalism, right? To go in this direction. The Trump 2 administration is pushing everyone, it seems, in that direction, versus this more diffuse multilateralism that I mentioned. And so the first point of acceptance is just that compromises will have to be made, as I said, but in the pursuit only of core interests. Should there be no wavering? Does this mean that small states and power should be more ambiguous in the G2 rivalry that they're facing? Should they be more ambiguous in the G2 rivalry that they're facing, and just push for the global governance transformation where they find it possible? I think prescriptively, instinctively, this is probably where those 21 actors ought to go. By building coalitions with like-minded states, issue-based, I think, primarily, on both sides of the equator, not to use that awful notion that everyone also always uses. So thanks very much for putting that in your email as a kind of alternative to the global South notion. And invest more in engaging with those like-minded states on specific issues. On the instrument side, I think the tension really lies, or the choice needs to be made, between those flexible governance systems and accountability. And with that, I mean transparency in decision-making, rules-based enforcement as well. Here, one will need to be strategic, and I mean, this is obvious enough to say, but to actually prioritize them in those areas is very, very difficult. I would probably identify areas where binding rules might be more easily, or might be feasible, which would be probably in digital finance, where there is an interest, possible. Health. We saw the pandemics treaty that might, I don't know, is there more in the offing? We'll hear more in that panel. And migration. Have the global compact, of course. You mentioned also the scary figures, UNHCR. Certainly from a European perspective, this is the biggest bogeyman politically, where money might be more readily available. Of course, with addressing root causes, one would hope. But it forces also a difficult choice in some other areas. You know, is there a need for a change in the course of action on Europe's Green Deal, for example, which has already happened to a certain extent on trade? We saw the Turnbull summit, between the US and the European Commission, which was a disaster as far as optics were concerned. And we'll see the fine print, once it is maybe agreed, but all of that is still to be played for. On finance, the tension lies between voluntary funding and plugging, the shortfalls that have been left by the US and by others, other key actors. You mentioned, Hilke, that on the European level, there is basically no extra money available. It's going to defense, health and safety first, right? So that excludes UN core funding. But what about those areas where interests are otherwise threatened? The refugee crisis, as was mentioned, migration regime. To end with a couple of priorities, I think, for all of these actors, is you can see the obvious trade-offs in making those choices, sacrificing values, going against your own constitutional principles, the risk of an application of double standards across different policy areas, the potential loss of partners, rules-based interested partners, which might be the corollary of that, the resource constraints that were mentioned already. And I think here the priorities actually should be quite clear. I mean, when in doubt, follow your principles, follow your values. There should be no wavering in that respect, I think, in the pursuit of a consistent application of multilateral rules on the fundamentals, human rights, democracy, and then come, I think, quite quickly, migration, climate change, and trade being an obvious fundamental for many of the open market economies, which the EU is certainly one. And then, when push comes to shove, compromises will have to be made, as I said. But there, I think the escape route would be using informal mechanisms that might actually temporarily soften the blow somewhat, buy time, in hope for firmer, more accountable structures in the future. And then targeted institutional reform would of course have to be pursued where possible, in particular then to boost compliance. And there are mechanisms where the US is still fully in play with money. The plastics treaty was mentioned to us recently in conversations with EU officials. Some technical issues that advances can certainly be made. And then key in all of this is, of course, assertive policy and regulatory alignment in the pursuit of global governance system, whereby both domestic audiences are reassured through strategic communications about the benefits of global governance, and at the same time, diplomacy is used more proactively to soften the naysayers on the international stage. And hopefully, that will conveying that interest-based message for small states and middle powers in a more convincing way might help also salvage some of those multilateral structures. And then, the eternal question, of course, securing predictable funding, particularly for those not nice to have, but need to haves on the global governance that will be a difficult policy discussion across various areas where compromises have to be made. And so those would be the issues that I would be looking forward to when listening to the policy-specific presentations in the panels that are to come. And I look forward to deriving much more inspiration from that to try and flesh out this this matrix of strategic process.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And hear from Team Trump.
Thank you. Thank you, and Clara, inviting us to join this, having us here. Thank you. Actually, there will be a specific panel on trade, but I don't know what else I can talk about. So I have to talk about the global trade governance. Which actually has been on the hardest attack since 2017, especially since this year, the so-called Liberation Day. The WTO has been just ignored. So as a WTO person for more than 25 years, first they say that the WTO does not deserve all of this. It actually has made a lot of positive contributions. So in my view, in comparison to the old imperialist system before the Second World War, the most admirable and valuable merit of the US-led multilateral trading system is the political equality among the members, meaning that no country has the political superiority to exploit or despoil the others. Countries are voluntary to join the system, and it is basically the market economy mechanism deciding the international economic relationship between members. Therefore, every country under the system can develop their economies and international competitiveness on the basis of their own comparative advantage. However, under this system, the leader will also breed and foster competitiveness to itself, simply because nobody can win always in the market competition. Then in 1970s and 1980s, Japan became the largest beneficiary of the system, but also the most serious challenger to the US economic supremacy. Because Japan is much smaller than the US in terms of the area, population, and economic potential, especially Japan is an ally under the protection of the US. The competition between US and Japan came to an end peacefully with the victory of the US. And the multilateral economic system survived and even prospered more after 1990s. But there are always new competitors emerging. Since 1990s, China became the successor of Japan, but with much larger scale. In particular, China's accession to the WTO in 2001 mean that China was fully accepted by the multilateral system, under which China maximized its comparative advantage and made a great success. Actually, this is also a great success of the US-led system in terms of promoting world trade and economic development. But in the eyes of the US, this is a failure for itself. So I think that the biggest this is the biggest dilemma of the system. The stability or survival of the system depends on the economic ascendancy and the self-confidence of the leader vis-a-vis its competitors. As long as there's a peer competitor emerging and the leader is facing serious challenges and losing its self-confidence, its willingness to support and even abide by the system will decline accordingly. It once happened in the 1980s as labeled aggressive unilateralism. The only difference of this time is that the new competitor, China, is even larger and stronger in terms of area, population, and economic potential, and particularly more independent. So the fundamental problem for today's multilateral trading system is the incumbent leader believe that the emerging competitor is threatening its supremacy with the help of this system. And then its best response is to destroy the system or expel the competitor from the system. The initial outcome is being witnessed as the increasing decoupling between the two countries. And an even worse scenario is a possible group confrontation similar to the Cold War. Therefore, let me talk about the prospects of WTO, which is expected to at least mitigate some kind of this competition between US and China. Actually, the WTO has been in difficulties for a long time. The Doha Round was launched in 2001, but there had never been any honeymoon between developed and developing country groups. After 2008, leading power and will of the US in the multilateral trading system has been gradually eroded. The focus of the US has turned to the mega regional negotiations under the Obama administration. In 2017, President Trump took office and reversed US trade policy tradition of the last 7 decades, breaking the basic principles of non-discrimination and trade liberalization. By the way, he put the WTO in the real peril of paralysis. The WTO has come to the moment of crisis. But the question is, has the WTO done anything wrong? Is the WTO causing these difficulties in world trade? My answer is no. In the case of Doha, launch and organization of Doha was just copying the successful Euro. The two rounds are quite similar in terms of a large number of participants, consensus decision-making mechanism, a wide range of negotiation issues. So the failure of the Doha is not because of its institution, but the changing reality. In the case of trade wars since 2017, it really shows the incompetence of the WTO in dealing with such unusual large-scale trade conflicts between lead powers. But in the successful GATT period, similar trade conflicts between US and Japan were not solved either under the framework of the GATT, but through bilateral, sometimes illegal arrangements, like voluntary export restraints. So my point is that the institution of the WTO is almost a replica of the GATT. The reason why the GATT had run well, but the WTO has been in trouble, is not the institution itself. What has changed is the world rather than the organization. But I don't think the WTO system itself has serious mistakes or defects. We should not blame the dysfunction of the global trade governance on the WTO. What we should worry about is the world is really changing in the wrong direction. But the issue is we have to change the organization to adapt to the change of the world, and then could possibly correct wrong direction to some extent. So the problem is whether and how we can change the organization. Therefore, I would like to make the two cases of investment facilitation for development and a special and differential treatment. On the issue of investment facilitation, the emphasis is actually not the contents of the agreement, but its procedure and formality. We know that IFD, investment facilitation, is negotiated under the format of open plurilateralism. Plurilateralism is not new at all inside the multilateral trading system. In the GATT period, actually most tariff reduction negotiations were conducted plurilaterally because there were always a number of parties, especially those less developed ones, not involved in the negotiations. While the more developed ones reached agreement, the outcome would be applied to the other non-participants on the basis of MFN. So in terms of practice, the GATT was actually a plurilateral agreement focusing on the single issue of tariff reduction of industrial goods. But the Euroground was the exception, which covered a much wider range of issues and truly adopted the multilateral approach of negotiation and consensus-based decision-making process. However, the period of early 1990s, when the Euroground was concluded, was also unique and exceptional. The Cold War was ended, two worlds were united, the global market was formed, and even the economic ideology was unified under the neoliberalism and Washington Consensus. That was the start of the golden era of globalization. But again, the world has changed. What is most needed is we should give up the myth of and obsession with consensus and the Euroground style, single undertaking. The best time of globalization is gone and won't come back in the foreseeable future. So we have to find a second best way to get through the difficult time. Then for the WTO, the second best is the plurilateral approach. There have been many arguments and demonstrations in support of the benefits and the necessities of plurilateralism. In the case of investment facilitation, it has been well recognized the feasibility and the popularity of such an approach. More than 3/4 of WTO members have joined, but it has been blocked by a few members, especially India and South Africa, due to the consensus principle. Of course, the best way is to convince them of the benefits of supporting investment facilitation agreements and the damage of blocking, and to reach a consensus finally. But it seems that it seems very, very difficult without a powerful and dominant leader. The US is gone and China is not ready. So I'm afraid on MC14 next year, those opponents to investment facilitation agreement won't change their mind. It is still impossible to integrate this agreement into the current WTO system. So my proposal to current participants or to the WTO is to implement the agreement immediately by themselves, to keep it open to potential members. Actually, China is proposing to implement this agreement inside RCEP. And so if possible, participants can also encourage the RTAs, which they join, to integrate the rules into the regional agreements and upgrade them. So it might seem a little fragmented, but in the already fragmented world, we have to make things happen in a fragmented way, but with the final intention of integration. So open plurilateralism is probably the only choice for now. We need to practice it as fast and as much as possible. And on the issue of special and differential treatment principle, I think it is closely related to the issue of plurilateralism. Actually, open plurilateralism is the largest special treatment offered to some developing countries because non-participants don't have to take any obligations, but have the access to all rights. As I said, it was happening during that period. Is there any better? So, is there any better special treatment than that? But regarding the principle of special and differential treatment, we have to admit that the actual effects are limited. The rights under special and differential treatment are basically procedural rather than substantial. While the developing country identity seems permanent, the related rights and benefits are mostly temporary. More importantly, the benefits of these preferential treatments are also questionable and uncertain. So I don't think it is meaningful to put too much emphasis on special and differential treatments. Both sides should put less weight on its significance. Actually, what I say, it's a waste of time to dispute about this issue. With regard to the existing SDT, special and differential treatment, there is neither need nor space to negotiate. For the future negotiations, I believe the principle of SDT for developed countries should be remained. Members should have the right to decide what obligations they want to take. However, if, as I said, the plurilateral approach becomes the mainstream negotiation model, the necessity of SDT will be much smaller. Members who are not ready to take new obligations can just decide to stay outside and wait and see whether or when they would like to take part in. So lastly, I would like to say a few words about China's position on developing country status and SDT. The Chinese government is very persistent on China's identity as a developing country for a number of reasons. The most important reason is we believe that we have more commonalities with developing countries than with developed. It is more comfortable for us to stay alongside developing countries. But for specific issue areas, the situation is more complicated. In the case of WTO and trade policy, China might have more common features and goals with developed countries, especially after China had become the largest trading nation. This is why China has been very active in all WTO negotiations. Just recently, actually, the Chinese government has announced that China won't seek for SDT in the ongoing and the future negotiations in the name of developed country. So basically, this issue has been solved for China. And we think that it is not necessary or possible anymore. But as all developed countries have their own sensitive sectors and issues with lower commitments, China could not always take the highest level of obligations on every front. So finally, everything is up to negotiations. So I think time's up. I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And now we'll hear from Monica.
Hi, and thank you. And hello to all of you, and thank you for making part of this discussion. I think I would be most helpful in perhaps raising a few questions regarding the overall project. And my field of interest is security. So you have not mentioned this area, so perhaps I didn't understand, but I actually just came back from a conference in Geneva where we were discussing nuclear governance, and it was quite scary, I must say. So I do agree that fragmentation is the word of the day, and that it synthesizes a lot of what is happening, and it is kind of useless to pretend it's not. But in the field of security, it seems to me perhaps quite problematic not to at least engage in attempts to reach universal governance mechanisms. And the crisis of the universal governance mechanisms in the field of security are particularly harmful and can be even more harmful. So I think that perhaps we could engage in a discussion on how this tense relationship between fragmentation on one hand and the need for some universal governance mechanisms it takes place. I think that before I say some things about the security field, and particularly that there are aspects of fragmentation that perhaps we should include in our definition of fragmentation, yes, it involves coalitions of the willing. It involves investment of different countries or groups of countries in some of the fields of governance, and perhaps we can take advantage of the interest, not only of countries, but also of social movements, of epistemic communities, and of market forces also. So this is one aspect. I think that another aspect is related to the rise of the far right, and the rise of the digital world, which involves fragmentation in terms of understanding of values, objectives, interests, and what we usually call the formation of bubbles and groups of different actors that have no capacity to communicate because they are completely alienated from each other. So I think that is one aspect of fragmentation that we have to take also into account. I think there is spatial fragmentation also, and then of course the issue of regions and sub-regions and the role they can or should play can be raised. I am particularly interested in Latin America, South America, or other sub-regions within the region and the role that they can play. So there is this geographic aspect. And I think there's a temporal aspect also of fragmentation, where you have many ad hoc attempts to deal with some specific issues, and then this kind of disappears and then appears again, and it's fragmentation in time that I think we should be also looking at. So I totally agree that fragmentation is the word of the day, but it is of course problematic in terms of the fact that some of these issues are not adapted, say, to the forms of fragmentation that exist. You mentioned climate change. That is, of course, one issue. You mentioned the digital world, and I would add, in terms of fields of interaction that demand governance, and I think demand global governance, the interaction in space, our dependence in the world of satellites, if you want, but also the move towards economic exploration of space, and also the need to govern the seas in very new ways, that the mechanisms that we have available are not enough because of the economic interest in and the technological capacity to explore the deep seas. So I think that in different areas there are demands for governance that will put this tension between the fragmentation and the universal in focus. In the field of security specifically, I call your attention to the fact that what we see today is an expansion of the use of violence, and again, many different ways. In terms, we have seen this more obviously during the last few years in Ukraine, in Gaza, but also in other parts of the world, such as Sudan, Congo. So I mean, we really are in a situation. If you look at the data of expansion of the use of violence as a form of social interaction. And the rules that we had that were universal, particularly humanitarian law, are in a huge crisis. So this in itself is quite scary in terms of collective security. We're down to almost nothing. You mentioned the lack of UN Security Council resolutions. But of course, in the field the two fields I've been studying, this is particularly dramatic in terms of nuclear weapons. We see today an expansion of the role of nuclear weapons, be it because of the countries that use them as a not as a weapon in use, but as a threat. And the Chinese expansion of the nuclear sphere, quite clear. The countries that were not considering the nuclear project are considering it. During this seminar in Geneva, of particular interest was South Korea and South Korean projects, but also the countries, the 9 countries that already have nuclear weapons are expanding their use in terms of doctrine, the possibility of use of nuclear weapons, but also in terms of association with other technologies. In terms of tactical weapons that are actually usable. So the idea that the nuclear taboo, the so-called nuclear taboo that in some authors considered that protected us from a new Hiroshima or Nagasaki, is itself in crisis. And what we heard is Russia mentioning the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons within the context of the war with Ukraine, the treatment of Chernobyl as the weaponization of Chernobyl in a certain sense should be mentioned. The fact that testing of nuclear weapons is again on the table, the last, of course, mentioned by the Trump administration. The fact that there is an expansion of the use of nuclear technology, so the issue of dual use is also raising questions on the need for new mechanisms. And in this case, I just put to you that we do need universal mechanisms that can deal with this situation. And finally, I just would like to add that the return of geopolitics has been a huge theme during the last few years, impacting the discussion on weapons in general, but nuclear weapons in particular. And I ask you, and this is really a question, in what measure can we think of the negotiation of spheres of influence as a mechanism of governance that is available in the context of fragmentation? So should we expect China, Russia, the United States to be negotiating spheres of influence? And this has been very much the discourse on the table. We see that this worked in the past in terms of the Soviet Union, the United States relations, but we also see that it is the fragile mechanism for governance, and we're living it through it right now, this minute, within the context of the crisis in the Caribbean regarding Venezuela, the enormous American military presence in the region, and the question on whether China and Russia will accept the idea that this is the US sphere of influence, whether the concept put on the table of the idea of sphere of security plays a role here. So this is could be considered a governance nothing to do with multilateralism, but could be considered a governance mechanism within the context of fragmentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Monica. I think we have about 20 minutes now for questions. Shortly before 11, the hordes should be arriving. So we should probably be ready for them at that time. See, Andrea has a question. We have a mic, yeah? I saw a mic somewhere. I'm moving a mobile mic.
You know, it's not there.
I saw one somewhere. Morning.
Vai ter que ser sem microfone, cara.
Hã?
Vai ter que ser sem microfone meio.
Okay, let's go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think it's the start for the 2 days of discussions. And I have a question that maybe apply to everyone, but first more directly to the government's presentation in the beginning, which is about the choices. Because it seems to me that you're referring choices made by those actors, including the state and nation actors. But I would ask you if you don't agree that those states absolutely make those choices very fight internally. Brings us back to the question of domestic instability as well. And the point of here working about this connection between the stability at the global level, the price of the business, with the instabilities at the domestic level, prices of democracy. So the question is, to what extent those choices made by certain governments in a certain period of time in the democratic states can be taken seriously. Because we see these in Latin America, time to change government every 40 years can have completely new agreements and from organizations or new treaties. So how can we stabilize even the confidence that those choices being made are going to be implemented time? And then connected to that, if it's not leading to a certain demand for authoritarianism, both on the left, on the right, whatever, what kind, but already from that point of view, of bringing some continuity or stability, which, as you all mentioned, a lot of cases are quite urgent in Brest, including violence and nuclear aid. So how to square that circle by bringing some multilateralism, which is accountable, etc., but also how these choices can be made as together.
Thank you, Andrea, for this really easy question. I suppose it's the holy grail you've been working towards for the past couple of years with colleagues, but I'll give you an answer real quick. I guess part of the answer would lie, in all modesty, I suppose part of the answer would lie in, first of all, accepting the domestic representative voice at the international level as being one which is an expression of a commitment that is sustainable. I mean, otherwise you can't exact any type of international relations. Any word with a signature should mean what it is. I know that there are certain cultures where Russia is well studied in this respect, but there are others too, where contracts don't mean very much in order maybe a way to buy time. I think at the international level, there is otherwise no way in making sure that there is backup to those words and those commitments as represented in a particular moment in time. Whether it is, the possibility of flip-flopping later on under a different democratic or autocratic political constellation, I think is a matter of a second concern, which would have to be addressed by tougher accountability issues. First of all, the benefits from participation ought to be visible to all involved, and the costs of withdrawal as well. In raising the costs of withdrawal, the system might become more robust, obviously, and create a buy-in without necessarily diminishing the sovereign rights of withdrawal. This sounds abstract, but I have Brexit in mind, where you have ultimately a populist government that is taking a country out of a regulatory and policy system from which it has benefited objectively quite a bit, where, what is it now, almost 10 years after the votes, there's empirical evidence to show that global Britain hasn't matured as a policy project to the extent that the Conservative Party at the time wished for, and where in objective economic statistical metrics, the country is worse off than where it's shielded, within a larger cooperative multilateral framework. And I'm not sure whether the strategic communication at the time was sufficient in order to convince, majority of the Brits voting in the referendum to leave the EU in that context. So accountability would be one part of my answer, but of course you can't deny the sovereign choices that countries ultimately make. You can't hold them against their will in an international organization. So adaptation within the organization then becomes a potential avenue for keeping them wedded to at least the core of the regulatory and institutional framework that it has earlier chosen to join. This is what, in short shrift, I tried to allude to when there was clear alignment of domestic policy interests and regulatory and institutional alignment at the international level ought to be. But this is just a knee-jerk reaction to a very difficult question, where you certainly have identified other aspects where I'd be keen to hear what we found.
Also, to be frank.
Yeah, maybe I still want to pick up on two things that the panelists mentioned. And I think there were in many ways wonderful illustrations. So I was greatly thankful for the example you gave on plurilaterals as WTO. Because I think in the minds of a lot of people, WTO is China, US conflict. But here actually, the challenging roadblock from a European and also the Chinese perspective is then with India and South Africa, right? So I think that shows so neatly that there are so many actor type constellations there that I think is important. And I'm also not sure, and I think we can discuss that in the next panel, to what extent the Chinese move with regards to different types of treatments for future agreements has been appreciated really by all other actors. And I think these are the type of opportunities that needs to be more exploded. I was very grateful for your intervention on security, because that's indeed not a policy area that our project, this is another project, does take it on board. But I, yeah, also wanted to make on the point of security that half full, half empty type of comment. So UN peacekeeping is, I think, a key area. US peacekeeping around 15 years ago, there were more than 100,000 peacekeepers over 60 missions worldwide. We have now about 40,000 left. With the Trump budget cuts, we're going to go another 25% lower. So we might end up with 30,000 peacekeepers, some extra ad hoc missions, maybe including in Palestine. But 30,000 peacekeepers is still 3 times as much as at the end of the Cold War, right? So at the end of the Cold War, there were 11,000 peacekeepers. And so I think that's also something we need to, keep reminding ourselves that we're not quite back to Cold War levels. And I think part of this has to do as well with policy complexity. We've had these big type of peacekeeping operations that in the eyes of many simply didn't deliver effectively on their mandates. They didn't ensure sustainable peace. On the spheres of influence thing, I recommend everybody to read the paper by Stacey Goddard in Foreign Affairs. I think it was in the May issue, precisely on this. But I fundamentally disagree with me. I'm not going to be talking about what you think here in terms of the US taking over Latin America's sphere of influence, but I can talk a little bit about Russia taking over Europe. I mean, come on. We're talking about a country that has the GDP of Spain. We're not going to be taken over in Central and Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, in the sphere of influence of Russia, and let alone that Trump could negotiate such a deal with Putin. See, that's just type of wishful thinking. So I don't see that at all as type of fundamental alternative to how we organize the globe, which brings me then back to some of the optimism for the multilateral system since the building.
Can I maybe add a thought on that? And maybe put it to Monica. When thinking about the strategic choices that smaller actors are nevertheless key for the transformation of certain multilateral systems and global governance systems, have to make would be actually to stand their ground internationally would be to boost their military clout. Because then they won't be pushed around that much anymore. That's, what South Korea might be thinking, to go nuclear. And what is shielded maybe Israel for one shield for a long time. So would one of our policy recommendations and that to be that military muscle of those states be strengthened in order to improve global governance and international multilateralism?
No, I think that this discussion on spheres of influence, as not, of course, choice, the discussion of spheres of influence as a mechanism is on the table, whether we like it or not. Jeffrey Sachs has been putting this forward, right? It's spheres of security is the term he uses.
Was that mentioned before?
Jeffrey Sachs.
Sorry, you will survive.
He ruined Russia. I need to keep that in mind.
But still, it has. It's what I'm saying is, what are the ideas in circulation, right? I mean, look at the Trump administration. They see, and read Project 2025. Spheres of influence is for them. They wouldn't use the term governance mechanism, but for them, it is the way you create some sort of order in the world. So I think we have to, if we disagree with this view of how we build order, and I would be very unhappy with it, let's put it on the table and discuss it. and deconstruct it, and as you did, but it is on the table. It is very much part of the discussion on global governance today, whether we like it or not. Okay, so you do regime change in Venezuela, and we'll invade Taiwan. So that's the logic, right?
On that note, we have time, I think, for two more questions. But I would say to have a short break, we have about 5 minutes, so yes, please. Speak this a little bit louder, please. We finally found the mic, okay.
Good morning. My name is Nelma Faria. And my question is, I understand that there is a problem, competition between China and Japan. China has problems with the agreement. And Brazil, if the problem and the agreement in China and Japan, that is has some problem about cooperation between China and Brazil.
China US competition.
I just did you understand?
So is there an effect on Chinese trade with Brazil from China?
In the Latin America, no, but in Latin America, because China has problem and competition between China and Japan.
US, you mean?
Okay,
You mean United States?
United States. And the
We'll translate the question.
existe problema entre China e Japão. Tem problema de cooperação.
Aí tá, assim, respondendo assim, eles estão focados nos Estados Unidos.
Nos Estados Unidos, aí tem esse problema. Eu vou tentar falar inglês.
So yeah, I mean, she wants to know about the Chinese capital. Basically. Yeah.
Not about your question. Because right now, actually, I don't think there is a fierce competition between Japan and China anymore. Because right now, size of Japanese economy is only less than 1/3 of China. So, yeah, I'm not so sure. But in terms of US-China competition, I think it has not much impact on Latin America. We have very different trade relations with Latin America as with. So, of course, Trump has this idea of sphere of influence, or this maybe the so-called neo-Monroeism. Anyway, but China, we are trying to develop economic cooperation with Latin America, just like BYD, right, has a new investment in Brazil. So we focus more on commercial relationship, not so much sphere of influence. Not.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we'll stop here and take up again the second panel at 11. Thank you so much. Welcome to everyone joining us for our panel as part of the undergraduate seminar. We're very happy to have now the second panel of the ITER project seminar on trade, global trade and Nepal. Moderator, Steve, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kenkel, and welcome to so many of the students. This is obviously the panel everyone came for. So welcome. We will be continue our conversation in a program which is devoted to the question how to shape cooperation for a world in transition, where we look at views from both sides of the equator and global governance transformation. This panel is devoted specifically to trade and inequality, or trying to prevent inequality, I should say. We have a stellar cast. To my immediate left, is Assistant Professor Clara Weinhardt at Maastricht University. She is also a non-resident fellow at GPPI, the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin. And her research focuses on global trade governance and North-South relations in the light of global power shifts. She has a book out in 2024, which is open access on differential treatment of developing countries in times of global power shifts, published with Edward Elgar. And she's also a board member of the German Political Science Association's Political Economy section. So welcome to you, Clara. Most importantly, to the researchers in this room, she's of course co-heading the Ensured project, which is bringing us together here in beautiful Rio. To her left, Deborah Barros Leal, associate professor at the University of New South Wales, but as you can tell, with Brazilian roots, obviously. You have obtained many of your degrees here in this country before going on to defending your PhD, I think, in Canada. Is that correct? Yeah. We're an assistant professor at the University of Fortaleza. And served as a member of the International Affairs Advisory Office of the government of Ceará in the northeast, as I've just learned, of Brazil. And her main expertise is focused on Brazil's foreign policy, of course, development relations, and global governance. To my right is Professor Suchi Li, who is a professor at the China Institute for WTO Studies of the University of International Business and Economics, located in Beijing, China. She obtained her PhD in 2015. She was before that a visiting scholar at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, and she's a member of the Friends of Multilateralism group and the Network of International Trade and Investment System. You can already sense from that her research interests, which are on the multilateral trading system, industrial subsidies, artificial intelligence governance, China-EU trade relations, and so on. And you're published, of course, widely in academic journals as well. And then to her right is Professor Paulo Esteves of this university, Pontificia Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro. He is an associate professor here at the Institute of International Relations and general coordinator of the Center for Studies and Research.
Not anymore.
On the BRICS, where you were.
No, yeah, I were.
You were, okay. Which also immediately reveals some of your research interests, which are complementary to the others of the panel. I think what is interesting to note that is in practice, you've consulted both the United Nations Development Program and the ECOSOC And you've also had an advisory role, a coordinator of the international relations, for international relations of a regional government, that of the state of Minas Gerais. So we're happy to have the domestic as well as international layered system here on trade on the panel. Without further ado, the rules of the game are very simple, 15 minutes max, and I'll be waving these cards actively to remind you of those. We kick off with Clara, who has a PowerPoint. Well,
thank you, Stephen, for the introduction, and thank you, Kai, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here in Rio and to present findings from our research. I'm going to talk about a report that is co-authored with Mikhail Paracek from Charles University in Prague, and where one of our Ensure project members, Jayati Srivastava from JNU in India, has also been a contributing author. And this report looks at the difficult task of reforming the World Trade Organization in an age of geopolitics. You may have not noticed the WTO's most recent birthday, but in January this year, the WTO turned 30. I think while this is normally a reason to celebrate, this year for the WTO has been particularly noteworthy in terms of crisis, probably one of the most difficult ones, with Trump's trade policies actively undermining some of the key principles. But I want to take a step back and not focus too much on Trump's second administration, and to think about, okay, what went wrong before the 30th birthday? Because the WTO has had, let's say, a maturing midlife crisis coming. And I want to look at the question of why has it been so difficult to prevent such an unhappy birthday in a way, and kind of why has it been so challenging to push through some of the reforms that were necessary to make the WTO more fit for purpose in 2025. So here I'm presenting a report first, and then I do a very brief outlook because Kai also asked us to specifically speak a bit more about the role of Europe. If you're interested in the report, you can download it from our webpage. So we don't have a clicker, so we always have to finger point. Okay, we've moved on. Okay, so what's the design of the study? How did we go about it? So our first target has been to identify what are the main reform agendas that have been going on in the past years, and then map the key actors' positions. And we focus in this report on the US, China, the EU, and India. But as Hilke mentioned on the first panel already, we've also cast the web a bit more widely and specific on the issues included more actors, because where these are the four key actors, Brazil, for instance, plays an important role when it comes to sustainable agriculture and so on. And then we've really gone into the different reforms, analyzed the reform steps, and thought to explore, is there any kind of unexploited potential for reform? And throughout the project, we're trying to do that through the conceptual lenses of effectiveness, democracy, and robustness of international. I won't go through the details of the sources, but I think what has been most interesting from our perspective is that we were able to conduct interviews all together with around 40 diplomats based in Geneva, but also complemented by WTO staff and other trade experts. So what have we done? What have we found out on the actor map? And this is, I think, a key finding for us, that the radically different views of these major actors on what would an effective WTO look like, what should it actually do, really have undermined these reform efforts from materializing and from getting the WTO to substantive outcomes. And I briefly want to sketch some of the disagreements among major actors about the purpose of the World Trade Organization. For some, it should be about containing China's subsidy-driven exports. This is particularly important for the US, but also from a European perspective. Then all major actors think the WTO should allow them more space for own industrial policy, so own market interventions with subsidies to bolster the competitiveness of the own industry, but not necessarily that of others. So that's not really compatible. Another fundamental disagreement is that the majority of the major actors thinks the WTO secure stable market access and a functional dispute settlement system. So that means being able to uphold the rules the WTO sets. Here the EU, China, and India are in agreement, but the US is not happy with how the system is working. And lastly, it's in particular India that says the WTO's main function should actually be to deliver on the development promise of the Doha round. This is also supported by China, but I think it's really key agenda point for India's perspective. And as you can already tell, there is no easy consensus if we only look at these 4 key actors in the World Trade Organization. And taking that as a starting point makes it very difficult to reach an agreement on how to push through necessary reforms. And I go through the 3 main reform areas that we've identified. So the first one is on negotiations. Okay, so on negotiations, this was mentioned in the first panel by Professor Shinkan Tu already. Normally, the WTO negotiations work with consensus. This means the 160 plus members have to reach an agreement, and it's one country, one vote. With such a diverse membership, this system of decision-making has really reached its limit. It's become very difficult for all members to agree on any kind of future steps. Hence, the WTO members have said we need to rely on a more plurilateral system, which means basically those that are willing to agree on certain further steps on trade liberalization come together and reach agreements that are valid for a subset of members, with the possibility of making them open so that the benefits can be extended to all other members. There is no consensus on whether or not this is the way forward, but we've seen those that are pushing for it to promote so-called joint statement initiatives. There are 3 issue areas in which they've been particularly prominent and successful. This is service domestic regulation, e-commerce, and investment facilitation for development, which was already mentioned earlier this morning. These negotiations have been concluded in 2021 and 2024 respectively. So that shows there is a subset of members that is willing to move ahead and make new rules and use the WTO for it. Yet, there is a legal clause that says if they have to be part of the WTO agreements, you need to have consensus again from all members. And this is important because then they become part of dispute settlement and so on and so forth. And this is where this reform attempt of let's just add a new layer of how we negotiate in the WTO has so far failed. And among the actors we've identified, it's been persistently blocked by India and saying that it's a procedural disagreement. It's not about the substance of the agreements, but we really think the Doha development round, which is multilateral and focuses specifically on the development agenda, needs to be prioritized. And if we start negotiating on other topics, this will divert attention. Hence, they have been blocking the plurilateral agreements. They have been supported by South Africa and Turkey, but most members are actually very much willing to move forward. But given the rules, it's just not happening. So here, also through the conceptual lenses of our project, we see a bit of a tension between democracy in terms of consensus decision-making and the effectiveness. But it's highly contested. And as you can see on the map, all countries where you can see a color have agreed to at least one plurilateral agreement. So it's almost all countries of the world that are part of these negotiations, yet because of the consensus requirement of making them legal, we haven't seen progress coming out of this effort to change the negotiation structure. Next slide. The second reform focuses on dispute settlement. So this is about how to enforce agreements. And here the WTO really stands out because it's one of the few international organizations that can actually enforce decisions and that can have legal judgments about it. Yet, however, starting from 2017, under the first Trump administration, one of the bodies that is part of the system, the so-called appellate body, which is an appeals body, was blocked due to serious criticism from the United States trade representative. And this has been mostly about US discontent with how they think China is benefiting from the existing system, which was also mentioned earlier today, because the US felt the panels are ruling too much in favor of China. Hence, what did the US do? It undermined the system. The US tried to step in with a multi-party interim appeal arbitration mechanism, which is meant as a stopgap measure. Again, those interested can join. However, a main limitation is that most members have not been interested in joining this mechanism. And apart from the 27 EU member states, it's around 30 of the 160 plus members of the World Trade Organization that have joined. So it's really not universal. Hence, there has been an ongoing process to try and reform the dispute settlement system, to try and address some of the current concerns of the US to get the system running again. This process was formalized in 2024, and you see here a screenshot of the General Council chair welcoming significant progress in dispute settlement reform talks, but again, this reform process failed and didn't meet the deadline. Next slide. The last reform agenda is on new agendas. So these are sensitive issues that are so far not covered by WTO rules, yet where members feel if the WTO wants to be functional, it needs to step up its game. This is about industrial policies, subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and national security. But again, while the members have started to informally get together and exchange views, the disagreement amongst the EU, the US, and China really make it hardly conceivable to see WTO rules emerging out of these efforts to address these newer issues. So here it has been really about informal dialogues and information sharing. Next slide, please. So to summarize the findings on the WTO, in this case, a transformation of multilateralism really is not likely because major powers' disagreement makes it impossible to achieve these deeper legal reforms of the structure. There's some progress in informal talks, but yeah, we couldn't identify unexploited potential for a serious WTO reform that could have prevented this rather unhappy 30s bursting. And we do see a trade-off between effectiveness and democracy, so the consensus decision-making principle. However, we would rather not frame it in terms of democracy because it seems to be really about major powers. So a single major power can block the system, which is not necessarily what making an organization democratic would stand. And just to add, under Trump too, now these challenges have increased because the US is not only disengaging, but actively trying to undermine more and more of the existing WTO rules outside of the WTO. And while the WTO, in response to Trump, has intensified its effort and put in place a new reform process under a Norwegian ambassador, we think this is very, very unlikely to succeed. Next slide. So what's next for the WTO? The WTO likes to emphasize that 73% of world trade is still conducted under WTO rules, but that figure is actually down this year. It was 83% before. And we do see that countries increasingly rely on bilateral or even unilateral agreements if they want to govern trade. However, that doesn't mean the WTO is dead because it still does a job. And I would also like to emphasize that in addition to administering existing trade, the WTO increasingly serves as a forum for deliberation and exchanges on also some decision-making at the technical level, often at the margin. So something like the Investment Facilitation Agreement for Development could possibly get through. We've seen this also in the second report where we looked at trade-related agendas, that especially on the environment, there is an interest in using the WTO as a meeting space and learning from best practices on this intersection between trade and the environment. There's another report. I used the last minute also to talk a little bit about the role of Europe. And one trend that we've identified in another paper in the project is the EU is becoming much more geopolitical in reflection of the changing context when it talks about trade. this line is the coverage of the way the EU talks about trade in its own press releases, and we've coded it using a large language model to see, does it talk about trade in terms of free trade or strategic interests? And you can clearly see that in the 2010s, it was predominantly about free trade. And now it's become increasingly about strategic interests. So the last slide is about what to expect from Europe in this context. So Europe is in a position where it faces contradictory pressures. On the one hand, Europe has benefited from the WTO and an open liberal trading system. So there is a strong interest in defending and reforming the World Trade Organization. On the other hand, we see increasing geo-economic or geopolitical concerns that Europe has vis-a-vis the US, but also China. And here, Europe is focusing increasingly on different measures outside of the WTO, making unilateral legislation or focusing on bilateral and regional trade initiatives. But the two don't necessarily go together. So we are arguing the emerging strategy that the EU is making use of is something such as embedded geopoliticization. And as a very last word, I'll read this quote from the European Commission on making trade policy. When necessary, the EU will take a more assertive stance in defending its interests and earnings, including through new tools. So the EU is becoming more strategic, but is trying to embed it in the spirit of multilateralism and trying to leave a door open to come back to the multilateral sphere. Thank you very much.
And happy birthday, W2. Thank you, Clara, also for sticking to the time and for laying out the global transformational potential, which you see is very limited, and also briefly touching at the end on Europe's role. But we're interested where like-minded souls can be found, perhaps in Brazil.
Well, it's great to be here. It's great also to be in a place where I can say my name, Débora Barros del Farias, and everybody's like, yeah, sure, it's a normal name. So yeah, I'm from Fortaleza, very proud. And I've been living in Australia for the past 7 years, where I teach at the University of New South Wales. I've been lucky enough to be publishing with Clara. We have a lot of overlap. Well, what I want to do is talk about the idea and the concept of developing countries. And essentially, my idea is to talk about a little bit about the past, the present, and also challenges in the future. It's fair to say from the very beginning that the world is messier, right? I think it's one of the things that all of us are looking at. And one of the differences that I think is that typically when we think about the world, we have a tendency, because there's no, 200 countries in the world, basically, we tend to divide countries into groups. And so one of them could be, east-west, north-south, developed. The reason that I focus on the concept of developing countries instead of global south is because I have a background that comes from law. And legally, I'm yet to see any international documents that separates countries based on the concept of global south. All of them use the concept, the legal concept to say developing, which you can imagine really poses a great set of problems now, because for some countries, it's, you ask more and more about China, is China developing? It's like, it depends. If you ask, most countries probably in the Middle East, if you're looking at Qatar, if you're looking, it's never that it's been a fully integrated where everybody agrees this is what a developing country looks like, or this is what it is. And so this is something that I've been exploring. It's always been heterogeneous, whoever fits into what's called, let's say, even if you look at the West, I think now I've been even thinking about, can we talk about the West anymore as a single unit? Because it seems that it's like the US going on one direction, and then you have the European Union going on another one. But anyway, if I have time, I'll go with that. But essentially, to think about the concept and dividing the world into these two spaces, the reason also I'm speaking about this is because within this discussion of global governance of trade, the self-identification as a developing country is where it has the biggest impact. Right? Because if you self-identify as a developing country, there's a series of benefits, there's a series of really things that are to the advantage of countries who fit in there. But this also fits into a conversation of climate, where this is very much present. I'm going to be going to Berlin for the first time next week. I'm going to be in COP for a couple of days, so I'm excited about that. In terms of finance, and it's still very much present in many countries' foreign policy identities, which is where I really find it interesting, because then it's not a technocratic issue of saying, well, this is your GDP, this is your GDP per capita, but it's who are your peers? Who is your group that you self-identify? So I'll just go very quickly here with the background. You begin to see this use as a self-identifying way of countries seeing themselves as developing, but they used to say subdeveloping or underdeveloping, actually right after World War II. It's worth going back, anybody who's studying international organizations, probably all of you will or have. There was an organization, the one that was supposed to be the first organization in terms of trade, which was the International Trade Organization, with the Havana Declaration, 1948. And the problem is that the US Senate never approved, and obviously, if you didn't have the US in 1949, 1950 in an organization of trade, it was defunct. But essentially, that already you have Latin American countries already talking about the use of us as developing. So it doesn't start, a lot of people attribute to Truman and a discourse that he made, the Truman Declaration, but it actually precedes that if you're going to look at it more closely. And then you had, the Bandung Conference, and then throughout the 1960s, 50s, but especially in the 60s, as all of these countries decolonized, they essentially saw what was emerging under this label of developing countries, like this is where I belong, right? These are the ones that are, the group that I'm a part of. When it comes to global governance and trade, you already had the GATT, the General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs, and the GATT actually made a really interesting shift between 1964 and 65 to really facilitate the entry of a lot of countries that at the time considered themselves developing. And I actually found the minutes of the meeting that they had around this time when they were discussing the point four, the point four, right? The GATT point four that expanded, where they said, okay, we all should have, special differentiated treatment for developing countries. But then in the minutes, you can see that somebody asked, okay, but how do we define developing countries? And they had kind of a discussion over this. They really didn't know. And essentially, they said, okay, let's find a solution for now, which is countries will self-identify as developing for the time being. At a certain moment, we'll find a better way. Wah, wah, wah. And so that was in the middle. So that's essentially 60 years ago. And it's still the same issue because they didn't know how to find that. And obviously in the mid-60s, you can even think, why would a country not want to take advantage and actually, put that, you didn't really have a lot of questions. Maybe Argentina, maybe a couple that you could say were a little bit in that verge. But essentially that label got grandfathered when the World Trade Organization was created. And so this is why it's still an elective system. And the main difficulty of changing, as Clara mentioned, anybody who studies the World Trade Organization knows that a change like this definitely would require the agreement of everybody on board, which with 160 countries and most of them having a lot to lose, they were like, no, we're not. And so the US under Trump, surprise, surprise, did propose a measure that would take, if it had been implemented, which obviously it didn't, it would have changed almost 60 countries from it would end self-declaration, and it would kind of put all of these different, criteria, and it wasn't accepted. And so the present situation now is one that I do understand that especially for outsiders, and you can say, well, how can China, being the biggest economy in the world, say that they are developing? And or you can say that in some cases about Brazil or about India, about other countries. And essentially, I think the discussion is not really on the technicality of what is their GDP and what is growth, but it has to do with the sense of still now in 2025, many countries, and that includes China, Brazil, and India, will still see the world as this coalition of being, okay, there's a lot of legacy from World War II. And the legacy from World War II has kind of, it's frozen picture of power dynamics, how they were, and essentially how, let's say, the West, the rich West, because also that's something that I find troubling, because, you know, living in Australia and I lived in Canada, and you know, I see students writing, the West is doing this, and, you know, and it's like, Brazil, we're West, but we're kind of like the poor cousins of the West. We're West adjacent. I don't know, like we're geographically West, but the West is doing this. I'm like, no, I'm not, you know? Yeah, so it's also interesting for me, I think, coming from Brazil and then being, again, in Canada and then being in Australia, and also seeing the different ways in which we categorize, because in Brazil, like I grew up really talking about, you know, global South, not global South, but third world and developing world. Anyway, the main question now that I see towards the future is not only related to the continuing discussion of how do you work with something that becomes more and more problematic. Some changes have happened, and that has been such a thing, which has agreed voluntarily in upcoming negotiations in the World Trade Organization, not self-identify as developing. So that's kind of a way where China, under Bolsonaro administration, there was also that idea of Brazil going in this direction, but I think it's very unlikely to change. Now, what I am interested in, and just to finalize here, with the ongoing discussions is how are global South-led organizations, such as especially the New Development Bank and the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, the AIIB, how do they categorize countries as being developing or not? Because then it's a different take, right? We're looking at not just the discussion of the global North and global South, but within the South, how will countries kind of say who is a peer and who is not? And if I have, can I have 2 more minutes? Do I have? Okay. The other thing that I've been working on is related to this question, but I think it's also something to think about. Probably most Brazilians know, not sure, but that Brazil is in active process of joining the OECD. And the interesting thing, what I want for people who are here, especially for students, is not just to think about, the tendency is to think, why does Brazil want to join the OECD? But I think it's really provocative to think, why does the OECD want Brazil? Why does, I don't know if you know, but the last 2 members of the OECD who entered are, anyone want to take a guess? Last 2 countries that entered the OECD? They're both in Latin America. No, not Mexico, not Chile, they're 2 more recent. Colombia and Costa Rica, which already means that the OECD, to be using it as, you know, oh, OECD as rich countries, and I'm like, well, essentially they're trying to change their perception of club of the rich from club of the good governance. But it's a very tricky and challenging thing. So that is something that I think it's also the flip side of the discussion of saying how another country that's also in the process is Indonesia. It's also in the process of possibly joining Peru as well. So these are not exactly, you know, the countries that ones would think. But I think it goes to show, going back to the idea of saying the world is messier, it's messier in the sense of what is South. But I think it's going to be also messy when you try to say, how do you divide and how do you grasp, you know, what belongs to the developed group or the rich country group. If you go to the US and you live in rural Mississippi, I'm sure you're not thinking, yeah, I'm part of the winners in the game, so it's this idea of inequality and this diversity. And I'll go back just to talk about Ceará again, because I'm a very, it's my place. But to say, I think it's an example also that represents still the usage of Global South, because you could be talking about within a country, these divisions that you have of the rich and the poor. So the advantage, at least, of that nomenclature is that it can capture inequalities that are internal and not just inequalities that are in terms of countries and the system.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much, Deborah. Yeah, you've really enriched the tapestry here by bringing in this specific focus on developing countries, self-identifying characteristic, but clearly some of the movers and shakers of transformation of the global trade system in the years to come. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that. China was mentioned already. We're eager to hear from Suchi, of course, her take.
Good morning, dear colleagues, guests, and students. It's a great pleasure to be here and join in the panel on global trade and inequality. The preceding presentations have offered valuable perspectives, effectively framing the context for our discussion. In my remarks, I would like to focus on a different topic on the impact of artificial intelligence on international trade and the multilateral solutions centered on the WTO. I think it's a topic quite relevant to contemporary debates on technology, trade, and inequalities, and also connects to digitalization, which will be addressed in another panel. The WTO's recent report on AI and trade released last year, and this year's World Trade Report all underscore the transformative impact of AI technologies on the global trade landscape. AI is fundamentally altering the production, exchange, and consumption of goods and services, influencing trade processes, patterns, and the structure of global value chains. These shifts present opportunities. On one hand, AI can reduce transaction costs by optimizing logistics, streamlining supply chain management, and automating compliance and customs procedures. Moreover, AI is reshaping trade in services. Services is a key word in the AI-related trade, and particularly those digitally delivered services and those transaction platform-based transactions. But AI also poses several challenges. The key question is the diffusion and application of AI are uneven across countries, sectors, and forms. And this heterogeneity has the potential to exacerbate existing disparities in trade and incomes. Absent targeted investment, inclusive policy frameworks, and robust international cooperation, AI risks reinforcing existing divides and creating new ones. So consequently, AI may act as both a catalyst for growth, but also a driver of increasing disparities both between and within economies. So developing countries face significant impediments to equitably sharing in the benefits of AI. There are several challenges that I would like to mention. The first of all, the disparities in digital infrastructure, including internet connectivity and cloud computing capacity, constitute critical bottlenecks, increasing costs and limiting access to AI-enabled products and services. In some developing countries, the internet penetration remains pretty low, severely impeding the access to information and services. Secondly, the insufficient data and computational resources constrain AI development and deployment. Many countries lack access to high-quality, localized data sets to train effective models, thereby limiting their competitiveness in AI-driven markets. Thirdly, the substantial human capital deficits impede participation in AI-related trade, shortages of AI talents, coupled with inadequate systems for workforce upskilling and reskilling, restrict the ability of developing countries to effectively leverage the AI benefits. The AI will have structural impacts on labor markets, which is a pretty challenge, especially for developing countries who are integrating into the global value chains based on their labor force, the benefits, such and so on. Firstly, regulatory and institutional frameworks are often underdeveloped. Many developing countries lack comprehensive policies on data privacy, cross-border data flows, intellectual property, and competition law, all of which are critical to fostering an environment conducive to AI innovation and trade. Fifthly, access to finance and market opportunities remains a persistent challenge, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises, which constitute a significant portion of the private sector, often struggle to secure the capital necessary to adopt AI technologies and participate fully in digital trade. These combined challenges place many developing countries at a considerable disadvantage in the evolving AI-driven trade landscape. The WTO research confirms that the benefits low-income countries can realize from AI heavily on the pace and inclusiveness of AI diffusion and productivity growth. Simulations using WTO's global trade model suggest that under a scenario of universal AI adoption combined with high productivity growth, low-income economies could see trade increases of around 18.1%, compared with about 6.5% under a scenario of uneven adoption and low productivity growth. This asymmetry underscores the need for international cooperation to address the digital or even the intelligence divide that could undermine fair and inclusive trade. So therefore, the pertinent question is, what measures can be taken to harness the benefits of AI through trade regime while simultaneously mitigating the digital divide? From a multilateral perspective centered on the WTO, I would like to offer several policy priorities in facilitating inclusive AI-related trade. The first concern relates to trade barriers on AI-related goods and services. AI development and deployment depend on access to global markets, cross-border data flows, and technology diffusion, all of which are directly affected by trade policies. However, market access restrictions and export controls in some, especially developed jurisdictions, impede the dissemination of AI technologies, products, and services. Although we have a lot of discussions on the challenges facing the WTO, but from a positive perspective, the WTO still offers a foundational legal framework to ensure predictability for AI trade. A critical question is how to ensure the WTO rulebook remains relevant and efficient for AI-related trade across different domains such as market access, cross-border data flows, subsidies for AI development, and intellectual property rules for AI-generated outputs. So where WTO members face persistent difficulties in reaching consensus on certain contentious digital trade rules, the conclusion of the e-commerce agreement within the WTO framework demonstrates a path forward, and China's pilot implementation of that agreement in the Beijing area, I think, provides a practical path to optionalize the negotiated commitments even before that agreement actually comes into force in the WTO framework. So I think we have to innovate our ideas to find more ways to make the WTO functioning beside the traditional ways. Secondly, the regulatory heterogeneity in the AI space is a growing concern. Comparatively, developed countries tend to have more stringent AI regulations. According to OECD data, nearly all high-income countries have issued AI regulatory policies, while much fewer middle and low-income countries have also. So differences in national approaches to data governance, AI regulation, and intellectual property and competition policy reflect domestic priorities, but they also create fragmentation that raises trade costs and uncertainty. For SMEs in developing countries, navigating this complex web of regulations is quite challenging, increasing compliance burdens and potentially hindering their ability to participate in cross-border AI-related trade. In this regard, WTO can promote dialogue and regulatory coordination through committee work and practices such as discussions on special trade concerns in the SPS activity committees. A key challenge is how to tackle practical constraints, such as limited resources within WTO Secretariat units and the uneven ability of members to engage substantially in technical discussions. Overcoming these constraints will depend on better resourcing of WTO work and informed discussions, especially tailored capacity building to enable meaningful participation by developing country delegations. Thirdly, developing countries face constraints in technology, capital, and talent. The gap in AI readiness requires tailored support to strengthen institutional capacity, develop human capital, and foster local conducive environment. The WTO capacity building and technical assistance programs can play an important role in bridging the digital divide. To the best of my knowledge, WTO is conducting some digital trade programs in Africa countries and also planning to do some in Caribbean and Latin American countries. So I think that is a good effort focusing on the AI field to bridging the digital divide. Finally, AI governance is a complex cross-sectoral issue. It is not only about the trade, but also about the security, the ethical concerns, the moral use, the safety, a lot of different concerns. So several challenges that shape the inclusiveness of AI lie pretty outside the WTO mandate. So it is quite important to facilitate the cooperation between different multilateral organizations. I think that is quite important. Such cooperation can align work on financing mechanisms, workforce transitions, education and training, and even the environmental objectives, because AI is quite actually energy consuming by building large data centers. So all of these objectives should be cooperated among different international organizations, and the policy alignment is quite critical. I will stop here.
Thank you, Suchi, also for sticking to the time. I think this presentation really brought the two strands that we heard earlier perfectly together. A new agenda for WTO reform in digitalization, which presents a challenge to all of the world, essentially, in order to prevent a deepening of existing inequalities and divides. So thank you very much for giving us that specific case study. Well, over to you.
Is that okay?
Yes.
First, thanks for inviting me, for having me. Thank you, Kai, for the invitation, for the kind invitation. I prepared the presentation trying to connect recent developments in the trade system and the so-called green industrialization of the industrial policies, particularly in the global south, in that case, among developing countries, and trying to figure out what would be a common agenda from developing countries or shaped by developing countries to foster their own plans. Many developing countries are exactly now presenting in Belém their own country platforms. Countries like Rwanda, for instance, which is going to present again its own country platform. But many other countries are presenting their country platforms to foster green industrialization and to promote what they call the ecological transformation. There are many names about that. I'm gonna keep with a very shallow definition of green industrialization, which is basically the combination of an industrial policy that combines some kind of concern about growth and and growth and jobs with the climate goals that were basically committed in the Paris agreement process. So my assumption here is that we are living in a kind of some kind of a power shift or transition of power, or whatever you want to describe this. And the trade tensions or the trade wars that we are facing should be understood against this backdrop, the backdrop of the shift, the power shift that we are living in. At the same time, and these tensions or these wars, they are affecting the multilateral institutions, in a time that we need the multilateral institutions the most to deal with issues like precisely green industrialization. So my presentation is organized around two moves. The first one is how recent trade conflicts in this multipolar context have undermined WTO norms and spurred new alignments particularly among developing countries, and why a new multilateral compact, which should be, in my view, should be led by southern countries, should be led by developing countries, is essential to achieving equitable green industrialization. So when we talk about, most of it was already said, and most of my points were actually touched by Professor Chin-Wan too in the previous section. I'm benefiting of the fact that we have a different audience, so I can repeat some of them for you now. But what we can see in the field of trade is actually that the power shift has profound implications in this field. Global trade governance is now being contested and reshaped by its own architect. So we're talking about the United States, but also Europe trying to undermine trade institutions, multilateral trade institutions, and they were the great beneficiaries of these institutions for many years. Even though we can argue that Japan, as you mentioned before, and China recently have benefited from these institutions, and of course the US and China and Europe were the main the countries that benefit the most from these institutions. According to there is a multilateralism index. I never heard about that until last week, but there is a multilateralism index conducted by the International Peace Institute, and trade is one of the domains that they look after. And in the case of trade, cooperation, in the case of global cooperation, trade was the domain where the performance of existing institutions dropped the most. Of course, this trend has to do with Trump's trade wars, but U.S. resistance to the multilateral trade system predates that, and this is something that we have to always remember. Goes back to the Obama administration, which was the first one to block the appointment of a person for the panel. And was kept during the Biden administration. So in a way, we can say that let's say the resistance against the multilateral trade system in the U.S. Is entrenched with its own foreign policy lead across the Democratic-Republican divide. So it's something that is we cannot see changing in the near future. In this particular survey, the Institute for the International Peace Institute found that first, trade has had a reduced impact if compared to a previous time on poverty reduction. The global average trade tariffs rose during this last period, which comes from 13 to 24, and trade facility 24, meaning it's previous to Trump, second term, and trade facilitating policies were also decreased or deteriorated during this. So if we want to understand what was affected in terms of trade by the U.S. policies of melting down the trade system, we can think about three areas that were most affected. The first one is the general principle of the most favored nation, which does not exist anymore. We could say that easily. The second part is the attack against the special and differential treatment, as mainly discussed here. And the third one is the dispute settlement system. I'm gonna address specifically the special and differential treatment issue, and I will benefit again from Deborah's presentation. When Deborah was discussing the concept of developing country and how this is related to the identity of these countries and the position that these countries, the stance that these countries have in the international system, I think there is something which is connected to that, which is really important to think about trade and development within the international system, which is the idea of international responsibility. And this is present from Bandung to the new international economic order, if you wish, or at least from 55 to 74, or even after that in the conference of the Buenos Aires Conference on Development Cooperation. And in all these documents, there is a very clear cleavage of responsibilities between developed and developing countries. And to developed countries is assigned, among other things, the responsibility to provide finance and to fund international development. And this appears in the concept of ODA, first and foremost. Second, it appears in the concept of common but differentiated responsibility, which was established in 82, but is part of this process, and the special treatment at the trade system, at the GATS, in that case. And this is actually something that was conquered. It was not, let's say, offered by developed countries. It was conquered by developing countries in the UNCTAD process. And this is something that we are losing now. And we are losing now because of the pressure that China faced during the last period within the WTO. China is now giving up at the WTO the status of developing country. But there is a risk, and this risk is, first, the pressure is not only within the WTO. The pressure is particularly fierce in the field of climate change or climate finance, and in the field of development finance. So when we see the retreat not only of the US administration from its own obligations in terms of ODA, and not only the US administration, because this is something that we see all over Europe, across Europe, every country in Europe is decreasing its own commitments. Every country but the Scandinavians, of course, is decreasing their own commitments to ODA. It's in a way a retreat from its own responsibility, some kind of abandonment of a status and a bunch of responsibilities that were assigned to this status in the international field. And this creates a serious challenge to developing countries to pursue their own green policies. And let's see what kind of challenges they have to face. So just to understand, when we talk about green industrialization, we are talking about a series of policies that intend to, it's another very shallow term as well, decarbonize the economy. But at the same time, they have to adapt and build resilience, because these countries, developing countries, are the countries that will suffer the most with climate change, first. And second, they have to keep creating jobs and reducing poverty in their own countries for the sake of their own administrations. So the challenge is this. But the current global governance system often favors developed countries, as we saw. The main beneficiaries of the global governance system or the trade system are precisely the developed countries. Trade rules under the WTO have constrained developed nations' industrial policies in the past. For instance, in two ways at least. Discouraging subsidies and or tariffs that these countries could adopt in terms of for intending to foster their own industrialization, and second, in terms of intellectual property rights. And Jayati Ghosh, an economist, says that if we look at the history of TRIPS, TRIPS is basically an agreement that prevented most or many developing countries to assess pharmaceuticals to combat or to fight HIV/AIDS during the 90s and during the 2000s. TRIPS was an agreement that basically prevent countries to assess the vaccines against COVID. And we are in the brink of having TRIPS because everything's shaking in the WTO, but TRIPS. Every principle is shaping at the WTO. The only one that stands still is TRIPS. And we are in the brink of seeing a new wave of industrialization where developing countries will once again have the role of exporting commodities without having any capacity of processing their commodities, these commodities in their own countries, because of many reasons, but also because of the TRIPS. Because of there is a series of agreements that prevent these countries to assess the technology necessary to process to benefit from green industrialization. So the first dimension that we have to understand that is present in the trade system that hampers or creates a challenge for adopting green industrialization policies among developing countries is precisely TRIPS. The second one is the ability of developed countries to adopt trade measures that will, let's say, understand the climate agenda in a broader terms, and I'm referring here to the EU CBAM and the ability of developed countries will have to impose to developing countries, exporters to exporters among developing countries, climate-related trade barriers that will protect their own industries and will provide no support for developing countries to achieve their own climate goals. Finally, there is the issue of financial or how to fund green industrialization, which is something that is also where developed countries are also falling short. And with the situation that we have now is quite interesting because 4 years ago in Indonesia, the G20 launched the loss and damage fund. The COVID. It was a fund on health. The pandemic fund. Launched the pandemic fund. 4 years ago in Egypt was the loss and damage fund was also launched. And these funds now, they are facing, let's say, a very strong difficulty, very tough situation because nobody contributes to them. Nobody contributes to this fund. And the main argument for that from the West, from Western countries is that, well, I'm gonna fund this, I'm gonna contribute when China comes in. And the main argument of China is, well, I'm gonna come in, I don't have the responsibility of contributing for that because I'm a developing country, and I'm waiting for the West to contribute. So that's the situation. Nobody's responsible for climate change or for providing a stable climate. And the situation that we have now is that this is happening in all the climate funds, particularly those who are actually devoted or mandated to promote or to foster green industrialization. So there is a lack of sources of finance for developing countries to adopt these policies. In that sense, and I'm concluding now, in that sense, it is important to think about a common agenda from developing countries, and developing countries are diversifying their own partnerships, but they are adopting a strategy of multi-alignment, which not necessarily means more hedging than establishing a common agenda to negotiate at the international level. There is a need of a common agenda that first establish a proper forum or proper arena to discuss green industrial policy, which is something that we don't have anymore because WTO is the way we just discussed. Second, there is a need of work with technology transfer mechanisms that would be, in a way, effective and would allow these countries to bypass the existing TRIPS agreements and have access to the technology necessary for green industrialization. And there are many examples out there. We can discuss that later on if necessary. The third point is financing. There's a need of a compact for financing industrial policies in developing countries. And finally, equitable trade arrangements that would assure that developing countries would have access to markets to export the products of their own green industries. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulo, also for, like others have done on the panel, securing this nexus between the trade agenda and other ones, and in particular, of course, here, climate change, green industrialization and development. You've all touched a little bit on the elephant in the room, Mr. Trump. But I feel there's more to discuss on that particular issue, as he is the main mover and shaker, it seems, as far as the multilateral trading system is concerned. So there may be questions about that. There may be questions about what futures lie ahead for the transformation. Is it going to be fragmented in specific issue areas, such as new agenda on digitalization, which appears promising? What leadership can we expect from any types of groupings? We just heard fragmentation actually on the green industrialization agenda, but there may be other aspects where the developing countries can lead. And where then would you see that leadership coming from, and on which topics? But this is just by way of giving you some inspiration. I think the undergrads here in the room get the first chance, to pose their questions to any of the panelists, or if you have any reactions to what you've heard, would be keen to hear them too. So with that, the floor is open. Please identify yourself if you want to raise a question, and also to whom you'd like to address it. We have a roaming microphone. Just raise your hand. You'll be second.
First one.
Unless there is. Okay, let's go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I will have a question.
Please identify yourself for the rest of the room.
I'm Xin from China. You mentioned that at the last slide, that the EU will take a certain stance to defend its interests. But from the perspective of China, the EU seems to be only assertive to China, but submissive to Trump. So look at the so-called Tinberry deal between the EU and the US. You made a lot of concessions. So does that mean the EU has also discussed in this geopolitical tension or confrontation between the China. The US has take a side.
Thanks very much. Anyone else? Just try and catch my eye.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful panel. You can add some project coordinator. I'm sure that we mastered it. I think ultimately my question is addressed at Paolo, but perhaps the whole panel. I think one of the major challenges is funding, right? And I think you raised the funding for climate change, funding for the whole range of transitions. Now, the Trump administration has been very clear. They're going to be not funding anything. It's the exception of the support negotiations, the atomic negotiations, right? The rest will be cut. For peacekeeping, for climate change, for all. And we have been doing a couple of rounds in Brussels as well, where the line of the EU very much is, this is very regrettable that Trump is doing this, but we cannot possibly step into this. And I think we're also coming increasingly to the, becomes increasingly to our attention that essentially the US has funded for very, very long without us actually appreciating, noticing. So, with a view of, looking forward, funding being, being tight, also in your span on defense and support. Do we need to think of a radically different way of funding our international institutions that goes beyond the type of developed versus developed country? Because I think the funding, it's done. The money isn't there. So if you have some ideas on that, it would be great to hear this.
Thank you, Hilke. Anyone else who would like to pose a question? No? Can I ask maybe to any of the panelists who feel competent, or anyone in the room for that matter, who may have closely observed US trade policy over the last couple of months, which started basically at the beginning of this month with, all these tariff threats on China and Mexico over fentanyl, and then switched to reciprocal tariffs in April, which led to global market uproar, basically, and then a retreat to then negotiate some agreements in a limited sense, and then a new round of reciprocal tariffs in August. But this week, in fact, the Supreme Court examining the question whether the exertion or the use of emergency powers by the Trump administration to impose all of these tariffs is constitutional. So it seems that the stakes for the global trading system are very high and defined primarily in the US. I see you nodding heavily, so obviously you have to say something about it. Okay, so that's an issue I would like to see covered somehow as well. Paolo, you had a question directly addressed to you, so, but I think you were first, in fact, Clara, with the Turnberry Summit question.
Thank you, Jingwan, for the question. First, I don't think the EU has taken a side. What the EU is trying to do is to become more strategically autonomous, be it from China, be it from the US, right? So this is really this idea of de-risking supply chains, diversifying trade. Is a more geopoliticized direction that the EU is going into. Why has the EU been, as you said, quote unquote, more submissive to the US? I think this is just a reflection of the security dependencies on the US that don't exist in a similar way with China. I don't think it has been strategic, like, okay, let's cater to the US. And we do see that in Europe, there are massive efforts to invest in the military capacities of Europe in order to reduce these dependencies seeing the discontent with how submissive Europe has reacted to trade policies in order to be able to be more assertive towards the US in the future as well. If I may, just to remark, because when Paulo spoke about the broader implications, and this is not part of this report anymore, I do think this trend of greater geopoliticization of trade is really going to reinforce global inequalities that we see. And this is not only because countries may not be able to play the game of industrial policy competition because they lack the financial resources, but it's also because the dynamic of how trade is negotiated moves away from the multilateral sphere with all of its imperfections nonetheless allowed more marginalized countries to team up and to bring issues to the agenda. What we see now, if you have a player such as Europe being submissive to the US, you can imagine how much did Cambodia really get out of this recent trade deal with the US, right? So the move towards these bilateral deals is very much a shift away from the somewhat guarded multilateral sphere of rulemaking to a really hard-on power-based world. And this is inevitably going to increase existing inequalities that we have, which I think is a problematic trend. I could say more about Heike's question, but I don't want to knock this because others may want to come in on that as well.
Okay. Well, can you hear me? There are a bunch of proposals on the table. CGD mapped these proposals. I think there's a paper published 2 years ago. But basically, what we have is first an attempt to separate ODA from global public goods. This is something that Norway is proposing. Commission in Norway proposed last year to separate ODA and the fund for global public goods. This is one. The second one, which is becoming trendy, is one on which I work in the last 2 years. It's called global public investment. And global public investment is different from ODA because all countries should contribute. And the main inspiration is actually the European structural funds, structural funds is the name, right? Europe's structural funds. And the idea is every country contribute, every country can benefit from that according to its needs. And every country decide about allocation. So you must have a governance scheme or governance mechanism to decide about allocation. There is already support from some Latin American countries. Uruguay is supporting it, Colombia is supporting it. I think Mexico is supporting it. There's some discussion with Spain as well in the European Union and so on. But there's a mechanism that is universal in that sense. I think that's something that you are thinking about. But this mechanism, from the perspective of developing countries, it should come with some kind of differentiation, not exactly the CBDR that you had the application of CBDR that we had in Kyoto, but something that countries will pay according to their capacity, but everybody will pay one way or another. So that's the main idea. Brazil proposed in 2013 in the COP in Lima, Peru, what they called concentric circles of responsibility. And the idea of concentric circles of responsibility is a way to operationalize CBDR. And in this way, every country would also pay, but it would also pay a minimum according to a level. And there was a minimum and a ceiling according to the level of the country. So this is another way to personalize this. Besides that, there is something that is urgent actually, which is SDRs. And I have to say, the main blocker for SDRs is, surprise, surprise, Europe. Or is surprise, Germany, basically. The German central bank basically says we cannot use SDRs because the European Central Bank does not allow it. Well, who has the say in the European Central Bank? So France is in favor, Spain is in favor. Many developed countries are in favor, but the use of SDR is a possibility that is being discussed. I don't see anything outside this range. Either use or reform ODA, separating from global public goods, or creating another thing which is universal, and in the short run use SDRs to boost climate action.
Thanks. Deborah.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna go on the US thing that you were mentioning. And I think it's just, I mean, let me use a proper word, it's a shit show. That's what it is. And if you look at it, and I was just reading some of the things and saying the problem is that if the Supreme Court judges what Trump has done as unconstitutional, one of the possibilities is that the federal government would have to give back the money to everyone, and then having a whole discussion on what is a tariff, what is a tax. But I think it's what's really quite surprising is to see just how much the world and a lot of the global governance, like several spaces of regimes and governance of a series of topics, it's almost still being hostage to the United States and the fickleness of whoever is in the presidency. And I think, I mean, from what I've read is that a lot of people speculate that unlike Trump 1, this administration really shows how the world is probably trying as much as it can to untether itself from a dependency from the United States. And that might have more long-lasting consequences of seeing, if you're Canada and just looking at, well, I can't rely on, whoever gets elected to the White House. Same thing with all of the other countries. So yeah, it's I think my only thing is that it's interesting to see. I think that's the word I would use, interesting, because or else it's depressing. But it is interesting to see again how these things are made and the global repercussions, and also how the world is reacting. But the word that came to mind is that when success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. And I think essentially that's what we're seeing in the downfall, and then you're pointing fingers at everyone. So it's still uncertain how much, especially with the recent election this weekend and seeing how Democrats have just won over every single thing, what are going to be the consequences when you really have midterms and you have all that. So basically, I think anybody who has certainties about US domestic policy is ill-informed. There's going to be a lot of swinging, I think, until then, with the global repercussions.
Let me add on something to this question. I think the US undermining WTO rules and deciding to stay a member of the World Trade Organization means there is little progress at the level of the WTO and reforming the WTO. But we should not forget there are other options. So 85% of world trade is not with the US. So there is tremendous opportunities. And one thing where we haven't seen that much yet could be of those willing to uphold open rules-based trade to just expand regional or existing free trade agreements. There have been some initiatives around this, but we haven't seen as much as we could. But Europe, but also China and others are concluding new agreements and thinking along these lines. And the other thing that could also happen, which we haven't seen, is a much more coordinated response to the US trade policies. Because what we have seen because of dependencies, every country negotiating bilaterally, trying to get the best for themselves, right? And I think there would be much more potential of countries getting together and coordinating a response that would be more powerful towards the position that the US is taking.
Which naturally brings us to China. Suchi, you mentioned, of course, the potential for global trade transformation in the area of AI, crypto, EU services, anything digital, basically. In particular, you spoke about AI. knowing the constraints on WTO reform, is it the logical channel to go through? And if it is, would a plurilateral type of approach be led by China, do you think?
Yes, I think regarding the AI arena, China actually is pretty active in global AI governance, focusing on international cooperation and capacity building. For example, China has proposed several policy initiatives within the United Nations framework on capacity building, and also Shanghai hosted the AI Safety Summit. So China is quite active and promoting the international cooperation approach. But we know that we have mentioned the regulatory fragmentation many times. Besides China, actually, the US, EU, Singapore, and other economies, they also matter. So if we look at the different countries' regulatory approaches, we may find quite different motivations and policy passes. For example, the US is quite market-driven and proposing the industrial self-employed. The EU is quite regulatory-driven, having the AI Act. China is kind of like between the both, between the two actors. On one hand, we have a quite advanced AI technology, so we want to foster the AI market. On the other hand, China is quite strict in data regulation, internet safety, a lot of issues relevant to AI. And we have to pay attention to the fourth factor, that is Singapore. Singapore is a vibrant country and trying to build itself as a digital hub. And also Singapore is quite pilot in fostering, formulating the regional trade agreements. China, EU, and the US now have regional trade agreements that have AI-specific provisions. So we may see very fragmented regulatory landscape. So the final words is that is why we have to cooperation, because it is quite difficult that you follow the one path. But for the developing countries, I think in majority developing countries, it is quite matters for the China and the US to cooperate, especially the baseline is not to conflict with each other, because it's like developing countries, for example, the cloud computing encompassing a lot of things that you have to choose between the China-driven technological path or US-driven technological path, because the technical standards, a lot of issues. So I think the baseline is that we have the US, China, EU, Singapore, a lot of typical economies that exist that in terms of the regulatory approaches. So the developing countries do not have to choose two sides.
Thanks. Looking back into the room for a second round of questions or observations. There in the middle, the roaming microphone. Yeah. Anyone else, please try and catch my eye.
Okay, thank you very much. This is super interesting. I mean, Clara mentioned introduce. My name is Mirko Heitzel. I'm an institute professor at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Clara mentioned sort of the EU going towards strategic autonomy, trying to deglobalize some supply chains and so on. So I was wondering whether, to everybody, whether you could reflect a little bit on what that agenda means for, on the one hand, global trade governance, so whether there's some unintended consequences for that, but it also might have distributional consequences. So what does it mean for low and middle income countries specifically?
Yeah, CBAM was mentioned, deforestation is another one one can think of, the whole unilateral turn in trade defense as well. Just behind Mirko, there's another gentleman.
I'm from the Federal University of Pernambuco. I have a question on Clara's final remarks, which picks up on something that Stephen mentioned in the first time. It would seem surprising that there's so much trade to be kept to be preserved. WTO, if only if more countries would take the initiative in safeguarding that, as the US So this makes me think about something Stephen commented earlier, which is, isn't it part of the strategy of well-positioned intermediate powers, like the 21 countries that were mentioned in the insured research, that they should be ambiguous, therefore avoid taking the entrepreneurship cost of salvaging multilateralism, as it were, and it's a safer bet just to let the big powers have at each other and we'll see who comes up at the top, and then think about where we want to invest. But there's this incompatibility between capturing the slack of organizations versus playing an ambiguous role as hedging on your provider.
Thanks very much. Final chance?
About 10 more minutes. So.
Yeah, but I mean, there's answers too to be given. They're not easy questions. Anyone else?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the fascinating discussion. It's very clear one. I'm a PhD candidate also at Maastricht University. I'm specifically interested in the broad discussion coming up the US role and the sort of this. This is genuinely just a question of interest. Where do you think there is a difference in positioning in the discussion you're having, in the sense of, to me, it comes across not all an expert in trade, I'll be honest, that US government is almost held hostage by private interests here as well. When we see the Trump inauguration, all the tech pros, let's say, all there, they have a significant, let's say, amount of influence over US policy. I'm wondering, is that the case? And would that be completely different in a Chinese context, where, of course, also economically speaking, we are dealing with a very different system?
Thanks very much. That should keep us going for another couple of minutes, Kai, so no worries. Clara, you had one or two questions directly addressed to you.
Marco, I talk about your question. I think it's a very important question to think about what are broader systemic consequences of the shift, not just in the EU, but also, I would say, in the US and China to be more protectionist and strategic in trade. Is there, the first question you had, are there unintended consequences for global trade governance? I mean, I think what we've seen, not just since the past years, this has been going on for quite a while, that of course there's this talk about how bilateral trade policies can be integrated into the multilateral system. But in the end, there is always a tension, right? Because if you have a bilateral agreement, you're discriminating against those that are not part of the agreement, and they won't get the better. And this has been exacerbated as we see unilateral trade instruments such as CBAM, which may actually get challenged in the WTO for possibly not being legally compatible with WTO. So I think this trend towards more fragmentation is an unintended consequence that will inevitably follow. The question is this priced in? Because it may seem more strategic to use bilateral instruments to be more geopolitical in what we do. And then there's the cost. I don't know if it's priced in. The problem is that I see is that at the multilateral level, with the given constellation of interests among major actors, it's just not very likely that this system is going to move ahead, right? So it almost seems as if this is the second best that countries have to deal with, and they have to find other ways of dealing with it. Because, and this is the second part of the question, this fragmentation is partly also reshaping the winners and losers of global trade, right? And this goes beyond the governance, but also who's able to play this game of industrial policy competition, right? Let's think about such critical raw materials and how this is reshaping the game. And I think the overall effect is likely to be, they're not going to be overall welfare gains, because this is a more protectionist term. So overall, nobody is going to be better off. But then, of course, the gains will be distributed very unequally. And those with more access to play this game will, of course, gain more. And I think especially lower income countries that do not happen to fit these strategic interests, right? So if you don't have the critical raw materials, there will be no diversification of trade to you, no investment in the industries you have. They will be even more marginalized. So I think a very likely consequences, as I said before, is that inequalities are going to increase, and it's going to be based even more on strategic considerations, whether or not you're lucky to benefit of some pockets of this French shoring and, I don't know, Vietnam building new manufacturing capacities as an alternative to China and whatnot, then any kind of developmental perspective that is about levels of income. Let's think about integrating least developed countries better in the global economy. So I think this is clearly not going to happen. I'm not going to address the question on middle powers that you asked about, because I think we have two speakers from Brazil here on the panel that are probably in a better position to say, is this a good strategy or what should they be doing?
I'm an optimist by nature. So I'm thinking really in terms of opportunity, which is very cliche, like, oh, it's a crisis, everyone crisis opportunity. But I mean, in some cases it is, right? I don't think countries such as Brazil or, you know, Turkey or Indonesia, they do have the capacity of massive change in a global scale, like big, but they can lead in a series of different areas. And I mean, if I want to be an optimist, you can also think that maybe that's exactly where it might be more likely to have a country like that to be leading something, an initiative, than maybe saying, you know, this is a US-led initiative, EU-led initiative, a China-led initiative, because there's so much heavy politics that comes attached to something like that. So there is an opportunity, but again, the question is, who's willing to put up the political capital to be risking the time and the efforts and the money to be gaining something? I think, I mean, to talk about Brazilian politics, you can divide the room and half the people can leave. But essentially, I think that, you know, Brazil is at least putting out really good and interesting ideas. I don't know if they'll catch, but it is, I mean, at least, so let me put it like this, being from Brazil and living abroad, it's incredible how many people have a very, very good perception of Brazil still. I mean, there was a hiatus of about 4 years. Don't know what happened. Yeah, it's another story. But essentially, there's a really big opportunity of saying, like, you come up and you say, you know, you talk about Brazil and you talk about global politics, and it comes generally as a very positive, take a very positive perspective. And so I think that's something that could really, really be harnessed, because there is the problem of being really at the front. So there is a disadvantage in some ways of being extremely powerful, like China, US, and EU. The fact that you're kind of at the lower thing where you're not menacing. It's like, well, I'm big, but I'm not going to eat you. You know, we can be friends. I think there is an opportunity, but it depends probably on these countries finding out these specific niches that they really want to exploit, like Brazil, really in the space of environment, that is really trying to serve as a bridge. But I think it has to be a lot more strategic, because you don't have the capacity of the money, the people, the staff, of everything. But I think there are really good opportunities of, you know, weaving your way into these different environments. That's my hope.
Is that one shared with you?
Just complete. I think there's another dimension of that, which is the difficulties of having a coalition of middle powers.
Yeah.
And this is really hard. And one way to address that, and this is on the issues that I'm working on, I've been trying to open these doors, is a conversation with Europe. In the sense that if we think about the European Union, we are talking about a superpower. If we think about a country in Europe, it's not necessarily so. So when I see an op-ed assigned by Lula Ramaphosa and Spain. I forgot his name. Yeah, the prime minister. Yeah, Sanchez. Lula Ramaphosa and Sanchez. This is something that I think is a starting point for a broader conversation about reforming specific or addressing specific issues. I don't have any hopes about reforming or resetting the whole system, but I think there is some small things about like the Global Alliance Against Hunger or the TFFF, which the UK just announced that it is not going to contribute. But these are small issues where there is a possibility of a conversation among middle powers and among middle powers which include European countries. I think that would be key to bring Europe to this. It's really hard to say that to a non-aligned position among in between the superpowers.
If I can just
But
add.
if you hear JD Vance is basically saying to Europe that you are a bunch of developing countries. So
Yeah, and just so when I live in Canada and I got citizenship, and then when Trump was doing all of this, saying all the stuff and doing everything with Canada, I remember talking to a Canadian friend. I'm like, "Welcome to the developing world. Welcome to Latin America. You're Latin America of the North." Because I think for the first time they kind of felt like, "Whoa, this is really off. This is really weird. Like, what is happening?" So in some ways, we're all Latin America.
That seems almost too perfect an ending. But I would be remiss not giving the opportunity for some final thoughts to Suji.
So I would like to add one more observation. I have mentioned the regional trade agreement because in the global trade governance, there is always a debate on the choice of regional paths or multilateral paths. I think that is a lot of discussion in trade negotiations. But in this business like AI area, I think the two both can complement with each other. If you look at the regional trade agreements, the legal provisions for AI specific, you may find that the regional trade agreements currently are dealing with actually the safety issues, the governance framework, the acknowledgement of AI values, the international cooperation, all of this kind of like non-trade issues in trade agreements. And on the other hand, the WTO is providing a basically foundational trade rules framework. So I think that is one very interesting observation in this area. I think that is quite important to predict or think about what is the future path for global AI related trade governance rather than security governance, another topic. So I've done.
Thanks very much. And on your behalf, I would like to thank all of the panelists for sharing their wisdom, their opinions and insights from research they've been conducting over the last couple of months. So give them a warm round of applause. Lunch.
I have follow-up just for the participants, so you guys can.
Well, dismissed.
Right.